On a cold, rainy night in April, 1,960 inches, a dark alleyway in the heart of Paris, a father walked silently through the shadows, carrying a suitcase filled with more money than most people would earn in a lifetime. He had been ordered to leave it behind and walk away immediately if he ever wanted to see his son again. No police officers appeared. No heroes rushed in to save the day. There was only darkness, fear, and the crushing helplessness of a father who had no idea whether his 4-year-old boy was still alive or already dead. The kidnappers believed they had committed the perfect crime and would disappear forever with a fortune in ransom money. But months later, a mistake so small that no one could have imagined its importance brought their entire scheme crashing down. What was the tiny clue that betrayed these criminals? And how did a seemingly meaningless detail become the evidence that sealed their fate? The answers will all be revealed by the end of this story. Now, before we find out what happened to the person who picked up that heavy suitcase, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do. And we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every single week. So if that's of interest to you, please rent a massive billboard on the side of a busy highway and just put a bunch of deeply embarrassing photos of the like button on it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get back into today's story. To understand how that man ended up in that dark Parisian alleyway, we need to go back to the afternoon of April 12th, 1960. On that day, the sun was shining over the exclusive St. Cloud Country Club, which was located just outside of Paris. The grass on the golf course was perfectly manicured, and wealthy elites were sitting on the outdoor patio, sipping drinks and chatting while the sound of golf clubs clinking echoed across the property. It was the kind of place where the richest families in France went to get away from the noise of the city, a place where children could run around freely while their parents relaxed. On this particular afternoon, 4-year-old Eric Peugeot was sitting inside a large wooden sandbox near the edge of the club's playground. He was wearing a small wool coat and was completely focused on building a mound of sand using a bright red plastic shovel and a blue bucket. Just a few yards away, sitting on a wooden bench under the shade of a large oak tree, was Eric's nanny. She was a young woman who had been hired by the Peugeot family specifically because she was incredibly attentive and reliable. She sat with her hands tucked into her coat pockets, keeping her eyes fixed on Eric as he played. But then a man wearing a long tan trench coat and a dark fedora walked up to the bench. He held a large paper map in his hands and looked completely confused. He politely excused himself and asked the nanny if she could help him find the main highway back to Paris, claiming he had gotten completely turned around on the country roads. The nanny stood up from the bench, stepped closer to the man, and began pointing toward the tree line, explaining exactly which turns he needed to take to find the highway. The interaction was, incredibly brief, lasting no more than 30 or 40 seconds. The man thanked her, politely folded his map, and walked away toward the parking lot. The nanny took a steadying breath, turned back toward the sandbox, and her heart kind of instantly skipped a beat. Eric was not there. The sandbox was completely empty, except for the blue bucket, which had been tipped over on its side, and the red plastic shovel sticking straight up out of the sand. The nanny sprinted toward the sandbox, her eyes scanning the playground, screaming Eric's name over and over again, but there was no response. The playground was completely deserted. As she reached the edge of the wooden sandbox, she noticed a folded piece of white paper resting on top of the sand, right where Eric had been sitting just moments before. Her hand shook as she picked up the paper and unfolded it. It was a typed note, and it stated that Eric had been taken. The note demanded a ransom of 50 million francs, and it warned the family in explicit terms that if they involved the police or if the story leaked to the newspapers, the boy would be killed immediately. The nanny sprinted back to the main clubhouse hysterical, and immediately contacted Eric's father, Roland Peugeot. Roland was the head of the massive Peugeot automobile empire, making his family one of the wealthiest and most influential dynasties in all of Europe. When Roland heard the news, his entire world collapsed. The wealth that had taken generations to build had suddenly turned his innocent 4-year-old son into a target. The news of the kidnapping eventually leaked out, sparking a massive national panic across France. Parents across the country began keeping their children locked indoors, terrified that an organized gang was targeting young children. Despite the explicit warnings in the ransom note, Roland Peugeot secretly reached out to the French National Police. He knew that trying to handle the situation completely on his own was incredibly dangerous, but he also knew that if the kidnappers realized the police were involved, his son would pay the price. A special task force of elite detectives was quietly dispatched to the Peugeot estate. They tapped the family's telephone lines and set up a command center in a back room. instructing Roland to comply with the kidnappers' demands while they attempted to trace the source of the communication. When the kidnappers called the house to provide instructions for the money drop, the detectives listened closely. Roland followed every instruction perfectly, filling a heavy leather suitcase with millions of francs in unmarked banknotes, which led to him standing in that dark, wet Parisian alleyway, dropping the money into the shadows before speeding away. After the ransom was dropped, the Peugeot family endured 2 agonizing days of absolute silence. They sat in their living room, staring at the telephone, jumping every time the house made a sound. Roland paced the floor, wondering if the kidnappers had taken the money and fled the country, leaving his son behind in some dark room. But then on the 3rd day, a telephone call came into the police station from the owner of a busy brasserie in a crowded district of Paris. The owner stated that he had walked outside to open his restaurant for the morning and had found a little boy sitting completely alone on a wooden chair right next to the front door. The boy was wrapped in a thick wool blanket and was wearing a coat that matched the description of Eric Peugeot. Police officers and paramedics rushed to the scene, and when they arrived, they confirmed it was indeed Eric. He was tired, hungry, and deeply confused, but he did not have a single scratch on his body. He was reunited with his parents, who wept with relief as they held him in their arms. The boy was safe, but for the French National Police, the investigation was just beginning. A group of unknown criminals had just successfully managed to kidnap the heir to one of the biggest fortunes in Europe, extracted 50 million francs, and vanished into thin air without leaving a single trace behind. It appeared to be the perfect crime. Detectives combed the St. Cloud Country Club, searched the alleyway where the ransom had been dropped, and interviewed dozens of people, but they found absolutely nothing. There were no fingerprints on the ransom note, no witnesses who could provide a clear description of the man in the trench coat, and no vehicle leads. Months passed and the case went completely cold. The public began to believe that the kidnappers had gotten away with it and were likely living luxurious lives somewhere across the world. However, inside a forensic laboratory in Paris, a small team of dedicated detectives refused to give up. They spent hours staring at the original typed ransom note under powerful magnifying glasses, analyzing the spacing between the words, the ink density, and the shape of every single character. And then one afternoon, an analyst noticed something incredibly specific that everyone else had missed. He realized that every single time the lowercase letter E appeared on the page, it did not line up perfectly straight with the other letters in the word. Instead, the top loop of the lowercase e was tilted slightly upward by a fraction of a single millimeter. It was a tiny microscopic mechanical flaw, a defect that was completely unique to one specific typewriter. The detectives realized that while the criminals had been incredibly careful not to leave behind any DNA or fingerprints, they had accidentally left behind the unique signature of the machine they used to write the threat. The police knew that this tilted letter E was their only hope of solving the case. They launched one of the largest, most tedious, and most massive bureaucratic investigations in the history of the French National Police. Teams of detectives were dispatched to every single district across France. They visited crowded school classrooms, dusty business offices, massive government buildings, elegant hotel lobbies, and small typewriter rental shops across every major town. They knocked on thousands of doors, demanded to see every single typewriter on the premises, and then they would carefully insert a blank sheet of paper, strike the keys, and type out rows of test sentences. They did this thousands of times over several long months, meticulously packing up the samples and analyzing every single sheet under a high-powered magnifying glass in a dimly lit lab, looking for that one specific lowercase e that tilted upward by a fraction of a millimeter. It was a mind-numbing, exhausting process that required an immense amount of bureaucratic patience, and many officers openly began to doubt if they would ever find the needle in this massive haystack. But then, after months of searching and testing thousands of machines, a detective walked into a small typewriter rental agency in a Quapate neighborhood of Paris. He politely asked the shop manager if he could test the inventory, inserted a sheet of paper into a manual typewriter on the counter, and typed out a few sentences. When he pulled the paper out and looked at it, his eyes went wide. Every single lowercase e on the page tilted slightly upward at the exact same angle as the ransom note. The detective immediately seized the machine and demanded to see the shop's rental records. The manager flipped through the ledger and revealed that the specific typewriter had been rented out for a short period of time, just a few weeks before the kidnapping of Eric Peugeot. The names on the rental agreement belonged to 2 men named Raymond Roland and Pierre-Emile Larcher. The police immediately launched a massive surveillance operation on both men. They discovered that Raymond and Pierre-Emile were petty criminals who had spent years bouncing in and out of trouble, never holding down steady jobs, and living in cramped, run-down apartments. But recently, their entire lifestyle had completely transformed. Detectives discovered that the two men had recently rented a massive luxury villa in the wealthy French countryside. Neighbors reported that the men had suddenly begun wearing expensive custom-tailored suits, driving brand-new luxury vehicles, drinking vintage champagne, and throwing lavish parties. They were living like absolute royalty, spending massive amounts of cash without any visible source of income. The police quietly gathered enough evidence to secure arrest warrants, and on a quiet morning, a team of heavily armed detectives surrounded the luxury villa, smashed through the front door, and took both men into custody before they even realized what was happening. Based on the official records from the French National Police Archives and the historical reporting on the Peugeot trial from 1962, here is a reconstruction of what actually happened on that afternoon in April of 1960. The two men had spent weeks sitting in a cramped apartment, staring at newspaper articles detailing the astronomical wealth of the Peugeot family. And they decided they wanted an easy way to become rich. They drove to a rental shop, acquired a typewriter, and carefully composed the ransom note, completely unaware that the machine had a microscopic defect. Then they drove to the St. Cloud Country Club and hid in the bushes near the playground, watching the families until they spotted 4-year-old Eric Peugeot playing alone in the sandbox. One of the men put on a trench coat, grabbed a paper map, and walked up to the nanny, using the excuse of needing directions to pull her attention completely away from the sandbox. The moment her back was turned, the second man slipped out of the bushes, scooped up the 4-year-old boy, stuffed a cloth into his mouth to prevent him from screaming, and ran back to a waiting getaway car. They drove Eric to a secluded safe house, kept him safe and fed, and watched for the father to drop the suitcase full of unmarked banknotes in the alleyway. Once they secured the cash, they kept their promise and left the boy wrapped in a blanket on a chair outside the brasserie, before fleeing to their new luxury villa, confident that they had committed the perfect crime. They had no idea that a tiny piece of metal on a typewriter would lead the police directly to their front door. Raymond Roland and Pierre-Emile Larcher both broke down during interrogation and fully confessed to the kidnapping. In 1962, they stood trial in a packed Paris courtroom where prosecutors presented the typewriter and the microscopic analysis of the tilted letter E to the jury. Both men were convicted of the crime and were sentenced to lengthy terms in a maximum security prison, bringing an end to one of the most audacious ransom plots in European history. Sometimes a single tilted letter on a piece of paper is enough to completely strip away a person's freedom and bring a criminal empire crashing down. And other times, a community's absolute sense of security is shattered not by a typed note, but by a simple glass of wine shared during a local celebration that turns into a sudden, unexplained tragedy. On the evening of March 28, 1961, the small agricultural village of Kuzuo in Nabari City, Japan, was settling into its usual nighttime routine. Now, this was a deeply isolated farming community, nestled in the mountains of Mie Prefecture, a place where everyone had known their neighbors for generations. People here spent their days working side by side in the rice paddies, and it was completely normal for folks to walk straight into a neighbor's kitchen without ever knocking on the door. On this particular night, the village was holding a routine community meeting at the local civic hall, a simple wooden building where the residents gathered to discuss agricultural business and celebrate the upcoming spring season. Inside the hall, the atmosphere was lively, as dozens of residents slid off their shoes at the entrance and sat around long wooden tables. The men were laughing and talking loudly, pouring each other cups of hot sake from ceramic carafes to unwind after a long day of physical labor. But the women of the village were sitting at their own separate tables, waiting to enjoy a special treat that had been purchased just for them. It was a local brand of sweet crimson wine, a popular regional drink that was meant to be a gesture of appreciation for all the hard work they had put into the cooperative over the past year. So a few of the village elders stepped up and began opening the large glass bottles of wine, pouring the dark liquid into small ceramic cups for the women. Among them was a woman named Chiyo Okunishi, who smiled as she accepted her cup, chatting happily with the other wives and mothers around her. Sitting just a few seats down from Chiyo was another village resident named Yuki, who also held up her glass to participate in the collective toast. Now, nobody in that room had any reason to look closely at the wine bottles, and nobody noticed anything unusual about the faint chemical odor that was completely masked by the sweet, fruity aroma of the alcohol. The village leader raised his glass to signal the start of the celebration, and all the women lifted their cups to their lips and swallowed the wine. But within less than 2 minutes of taking their very first sips, the entire room went completely silent. Chiyo Okunishi suddenly gasped, dropping her ceramic cup onto the wooden table, where it shattered and spilled the dark red liquid across the surface. She grabbed her chest with both hands, her eyes rolling backward into her head as she doubled over in her seat. Before anyone could even ask her if she was okay, Chiyo slid off the wooden bench and collapsed heavily onto the floor. And then, right as the men dropped their sake cups and rushed toward Chiyo, several more screams erupted from across the room. Women were suddenly falling sideways out of their chairs, their bodies shaking violently as they clutched their stomachs in absolute agony. Now, the hall descended into pure chaos. Men were yelling for blankets, trying to pull their wives off the floor. But the victims were completely unresponsive, gasping for air as thick white foam began spilling from their lips. Within a matter of minutes, 17 different women were writhing on the wooden floor of the Civic Hall, all experiencing the exact same violent convulsions. Local doctors and emergency responders from the neighboring districts rushed to the village, but the remote mountain roads made it incredibly difficult for ambulances to arrive quickly. By the time medical help finally managed to step inside the building, 5 of the women, including Chiyo Okunishi, had already stopped breathing completely. Their skin had turned a distinct pale blue color, and their pulses were gone. The remaining 12 women were lifted onto stretchers and rushed to the nearest hospital, hanging onto their lives by a thread, as doctors desperately tried to figure out what was destroying their bodies from the inside out. The local police immediately locked down the Civic Hall and seized the remaining wine bottles, sending them straight to a forensic laboratory for chemical analysis. And it didn't take long for the toxicologist to find exactly what had happened. The sweet crimson wine had been heavily laced with a compound called TEP, which was a highly concentrated, fast-acting agricultural pesticide. Now, TEP was an extremely lethal heavy chemical that was used by local farmers to protect their crops from insects, but it was strictly regulated because even a single drop ingested by a human could completely shut down the central nervous system within a matter of minutes. So this discovery completely transformed the nature of the investigation. Because the poison was a specific type of agricultural pesticide that every single farmer in Kuzuo had ready access to in their tool sheds, the suspect pool literally included every single person in the village. But more importantly, because this was an exclusive, internal community meeting where only local residents were present, the detectives knew that the person who put the chemical into the wine bottle had to be sitting right there in that room watching the women drink it. Paranoia swept through the entire community, and neighbors who had trusted each other for decades suddenly began staring at each other with deep suspicion. Investigators from the Mie Prefectural Police began conducting intense around-the-clock interviews with every single surviving man who had been present at the meeting. They meticulously checked financial records, personal diaries, and looked into old land disputes, searching for any possible motive for a mass attack. But after a few days of digging, the detectives uncovered a dark, hidden secret involving one of the village men, a 35-year-old farmer named Masaru Okunishi. Masaru was the husband of Chiyo, the first woman who had collapsed and died from the poisoned wine. But as the detectives interviewed people outside the village, they learned that Masaru's marriage was not at all what it appeared to be on the surface. For several years, Masaru had been engaged in a highly volatile, deeply complicated extramarital affair with another woman in the community named Yuki. And as it turned out, Yuki had also been sitting at the women's table on the night of the meeting. She had swallowed the poisoned wine right alongside Chiyo, and although she had survived the initial blast of the toxin, she was currently lying in a hospital bed in critical condition, unable to speak to the authorities. Now to the investigators, this piece of information changed absolutely everything. They believed they had found a massive, undeniable motive. They hypothesized that Masaru was so completely overwhelmed by the stress of maintaining this secret love triangle and so desperate to rid himself of both his wife and his mistress without facing the public shame of a divorce, that he decided to eliminate them both in a single evening. The police believed that the other 15 women who drank the wine were simply collateral damage victims of a cold, calculated plan to cover up a personal execution. On April 3rd, 1,961 police officers marched up to Masaru Okunishi's home, placed him under arrest, and transported him to an isolated interrogation room at the local station. Under the Japanese legal system at the time, suspects could be held in absolute isolation for days without the presence of a defense attorney. The detectives placed Masaru in a small, windowless concrete room with a single overhead light, and they began a relentless psychological assault that would last for 5 straight days. They took turns screaming at him, slamming their hands on the table, and refusing to let him sleep for hours at a time. Masaru initially maintained his absolute innocence, weeping as he told the officers that he loved his wife and would never do anything to harm the people of his village. But by the 5th day of continuous sleep deprivation and intense psychological isolation, Masaru's resolve completely broke down. He sat slumped in his chair, his eyes bloodshot, and his body shaking from exhaustion, as the detectives pushed a pre-written document in front of him. Masaru picked up a pen and signed his name at the bottom, officially confessing that he had sneaked into the civic hall ahead of the meeting and poured a small vial of TEPP pesticide directly into the wine bottles to end his relationship. Troubles. The police proudly announced to the public that the Nabari wine massacre had been solved, but the story took a massive, unexpected turn just a few weeks later. As soon as Masaru was removed from the isolated police cells and granted access to a legal defense team, he completely retracted his confession. He stated that he had absolutely nothing to do with the poison, and that the detectives had completely manufactured the entire story, feeding him specific details about the crime and forcing him to sign the document through intense physical and mental coercion under duress. He vowed to fight the charges in court and prove his innocence. When the trial began in the district court, the prosecution's case rested almost entirely on that signed confession. Because when the forensic team searched Masaru's home, his tool sheds, and his farming equipment, they failed to find a single shred of physical evidence linking him to the crime. There were no fingerprints on the wine bottles, no traces of the TEP pesticide on his clothes, and nobody had ever seen him near the wine before the meeting started. Due to this total lack of direct physical evidence, the district court judge actually ruled that the confession was unreliable, and Masaru was acquitted of all charges, walking out of the courtroom a free man. But the victory was incredibly short-lived. In Japan, prosecutors have the right to appeal an acquittal to a higher court, and they did exactly that. They took the case to the Nagoya High Court, arguing that the initial confession was completely valid and that Masaru's complicated love triangle was more than enough proof of his guilt. The High Court judges chose to side with the prosecution, reversing the acquittal and sentencing Masaru Okunishi to death by hanging. He was immediately taken back into custody and moved to a small cell on death row, where he would begin one of the longest, most agonizing legal battles in modern history. So for the next several decades, Masaru sat inside a tiny, heavily guarded cell, completely cut off from the outside world. Under the rules of Japanese death row, inmates are kept in strict isolation and are never told the date of their execution until the actual morning it is scheduled to happen. Every single day for over 50 years, Masaru woke up at dawn, listening for the sound of footsteps approaching his heavy steel door, wondering if that day would be his last. But instead of giving up, he spent his time working with human rights lawyers, filing a staggering total of 9 separate petitions for a retrial. As the years rolled on, independent forensic experts and chemistry professors began reviewing the original lab reports from 1961, and they discovered massive scientific inconsistencies. They realized that the specific type of TEPP pesticide found in the wine bottles contained a completely different chemical manufacturing signature than the pesticide bottles that Masaru actually owned and used on his farm. Furthermore, teeth marks found on the plastic caps of the wine bottles did not match Masaru's dental structure at all. This new scientific data suggested that the true killer was still walking free, but the courts repeatedly rejected every single appeal, refusing to grant a new trial. In October of 2015, after spending 54 years in prison maintaining his absolute innocence, Masaru Okunishi contracted a severe case of pneumonia and died inside a prison hospital bed at the age of 89. He had outlived his wife, his mistress, and almost every single person who had sat in that civic hall on the night of the massacre, leaving the true identity of the killer a matter of intense debate. Based on the chemical reports, the layout of the civic hall, and the statements gathered by investigators, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened in the hours leading up to the tragedy. Late that afternoon, a figure walked quietly down the narrow dirt path toward the empty civic hall, carrying a small glass vial tucked deep inside a jacket pocket. The building was completely silent as the keys were kept in an unlocked box near the door for anyone in the village to use. The person stepped inside, slid across the polished wooden floor, and made their way directly to the kitchen area where the cases of sweet crimson wine were being stored for the evening celebration. The figure reached down, gripped the neck of a wine bottle, and carefully twisted off the cap, using their teeth to keep one hand free. They uncorked the small vial, tilted it over the open mouth of the wine bottle, and watched as the clear, odorless liquid mixed completely with the dark red alcohol. The person knew exactly how lethal the TEP pesticide was, and they knew that the sweet, heavy aroma of the wine would completely mask the bitter taste of the chemical. After tightening the cap back onto the bottle, they carefully wiped away any sweat from the glass, placed it back into the case, and slipped out the back door into the fading sunlight, returning to their home to get dressed for the meeting, completely ready to sit at the table and watch. Their neighbors drank. The tragic event on March 28, 1961, resulted in the immediate deaths of 5 innocent women: Chiyo Okunishi Tokiko Furukawa, Itsuko Ishida, Katsuko Yoshimura, and Hideko Yamada. Despite decades of legal battles and massive public campaigns by the Japan Federation of Bar Associations, the Japanese Supreme Court officially closed the file following Masaru's death in 2015, ensuring the true author of the Mata Nabari poison wine incident remains a permanent mystery. And so, a simple cup of wine poured by an unknown hand was enough to completely tear apart a close-knit community and leave a man fighting for his life in a concrete cell for over half a century. But while some killers use deadly chemicals hidden in plain sight to strike an entire village, others rely on the absolute blind obedience of a powerful state machine to walk straight through a locked front door in broad daylight. On the morning of July 7th, 1,968-year-old Graham Thorne stood in the hallway of his family's apartment in Bondi, a suburb of Sydney, Australia. He adjusted the wide brim of his dark school hat and checked to make sure his socks were pulled up to his knees, just like his school uniform required. His mother, Frida Thorne, handed him his brown leather school bag, which was packed with his lunch and his textbooks for the day. Graham gave his mother a quick hug, walked out the front door, and began his usual walk down the sidewalk toward the corner of Wellington Street. He did this every single school day, walking exactly 3 blocks to a designated intersection, where a family friend named Phyllis Gershon would pick him up in her car to drive him to the Scots College School. Now the Thorne family had been living a completely ordinary middle-class life up until just a few weeks earlier. Graham's father, Basil Thorne, worked hard as a traveling salesman, spending long hours on the road to provide for Frida Graham and their younger daughter. They rented a modest flat and carefully budgeted every single penny. But on June 1st, 1960, their entire world changed overnight. Basil had purchased a lottery ticket for the Sydney Opera House Lottery, which was a massive national draw to fund the construction of the city's new arts center. That afternoon, the lottery officials drew ticket number 3,932, and it belonged to Basil Thorne. He had just won 100,000 Australian pounds, an absolute fortune that was equivalent to millions of dollars today. In that era, privacy laws were non-existent in Australia, so the lottery organizers immediately published Basil's full name, his occupation, and his exact home address in the morning newspapers. Within 24 hours, the quiet street outside their apartment building was packed with people. Flashbulbs went off every time the family stepped outside. Insurance salesmen knocked on their door constantly, and sacks of mail from strangers asking for money piled up on their kitchen counter. Basil and Frida kept the curtains drawn, trying their best to maintain some sense of normalcy for Graham and his sister. They talked late into the night about using the money to buy a house with a big yard, where the kids could play a new car for Basil's sales trips, and a secure trust fund for Graham's education. So, on that Thursday morning in July, as Graham walked down Wellington Street, the initial frenzy of the lottery win had started to calm down, though the family remained highly cautious. At exactly 8:40 a.m., Phyllis Gershon pulled her car up to the corner of Wellington Street and Chatham Road, expecting to see Graham waiting on the sidewalk like he always did. But the corner was completely empty. Phyllis waited for a few minutes, thinking the boy might just be running late before she decided to drive up to the Thorne apartment to check on him. When she knocked on the door and told Frida that Graham wasn't at the corner, Frida felt a sudden jolt of worry. She knew her son was incredibly punctual and would never wander off. Frida and Phyllis immediately walked along the route. Graham always took checking the shops and asking neighbors if they had seen the boy in his distinctive school uniform. They found nothing. By 9:30 a.m., Basil had been called back from a business meeting, and the family made a phone call to the local police station to report that their son was missing. 2 officers arrived at the apartment to take a description of Graham, initially operating under the theory that the boy might have simply taken a wrong turn or gone to a friend's house. But at exactly 9:40 a.m., the telephone on the small hallway table began to ring. Frida hurried over and picked up the receiver, her voice trembling as she said hello. A male voice with a thick, distinct foreign accent spoke on the other end of the line. The man did not hesitate and said, "I have your boy. I want 25,000 pounds by 5 o'clock tonight, or I will feed him to the sharks." Before Frida could even process the words or ask to speak to her son, the line went completely dead. The police officers in the room immediately realized that this was not a simple missing persons case. It was Australia's very first kidnapping for ransom. The news spread across Sydney like wildfire, and the police department immediately mobilized hundreds of officers, setting up roadblocks across the city and placing a strict tap on the Thorne family's telephone line. Over the next several days, the entire city of Sydney was on high alert. The police received thousands of phone calls from the public, and detectives had to spend hours chasing down every single lead. They checked local shipping yards, interviewed known criminals, and monitored bank accounts across the state. Some callers claimed to have seen a boy matching Graham's description getting into a blue sedan, while others swore they heard a child crying inside a neighboring house. The kidnapper called the Thorne home 2 more times, repeating the demands for 25,000 pounds. But the calls were too short for the technology of the time to successfully trace the exact location. The family sat by the phone in complete agony, ready to pay every single pence of the ransom, but the caller never provided a safe meeting place to exchange the cash. Weeks passed with absolutely no progress, and the initial hope of finding Graham alive began to fade. Then, on the morning of August 16th, nearly 6 weeks after the abduction, a group of young children were playing in a massive vacant lot filled with thick brush and rock ledges in the suburb of Seaforth, which was located about 10 miles north of Bondi. As the kids scrambled over a rocky slope, they noticed a large, heavy bundle tucked underneath a low ledge, half hidden by overgrown weeds. It was a silver-gray picnic rug, bound tightly with several loops of thick hemp twine. The children pushed the weeds aside, and when they saw what was wrapped inside the rug, they ran back to their homes, screaming for their parent. The local police and forensic specialists rushed to the vacant lot and cordoned off the entire area with police tape. They carefully unfolded the picnic rug and confirmed that it contained the body of Graham Thorne. He was still wearing his Scots College school uniform, though his shoes and his school hat were missing. The medical examiner arrived at the scene and conducted a preliminary examination, determining that the boy had been killed within 24 hours of his abduction, likely by suffocation. There were no visible signs of a struggle or external weapons used, suggesting he had been overpowered very quickly. The discovery transformed the kidnapping into a high-profile homicide investigation, putting immense pressure on the New South Wales police force to find the person responsible. With absolutely no eyewitnesses to the abduction and no physical descriptions of the suspect besides the brief phone calls, the lead investigators turned to groundbreaking, pioneering forensic science. They took Graham's clothing, the picnic rug, and the hemp twine back to a specialized laboratory in Sydney, where technicians began examining every square inch under high-powered microscopes. They weren't looking for standard fingerprints, which had already been ruled out because the rug was too coarse. Instead, they began collecting microscopic particles that had transferred onto the boy's clothes and the rug during his time in captivity. After days of meticulous sweeping and filtering, the forensic team isolated 3 very specific types of microscopic evidence. First, they found tiny fragments of a distinct pale pink mortar, the kind used to bind bricks together in residential homes. This was highly unusual because almost all mortar used in Sydney at the time was white or gray. Second, they found several long, light-colored animal hairs that did not belong to any native Australian wildlife. A veterinary specialist analyzed the structure of the hairs and confirmed they came from a specific domestic breed of dog, a Pekingese. But it was the third piece of microscopic evidence that completely blew the case wide open. The technicians found several tiny unique seeds embedded in the wool fibers of the picnic rug. They forwarded these seeds to the Royal Botanic Gardens in Sydney, where chief botanists identified them as coming from 2 distinct species of trees, a specific type of cypress, pine, and a rare variety of annual plant that only grew in very specific soil conditions. The botanists explained that these 2 plants were not native to the Seaforth area where the body was found, meaning the boy had to have been held in a location where these exact trees were growing in close proximity to a house with pink brick mortar. The detectives took this botanical and geological data and began physically mapping out the city of Sydney. They consulted with city architects, bricklayers, and nursery owners looking for neighborhoods where houses had been built using pink mortar between 1955 and 1959, and where cypress pine trees had been planted in the yards. By overlaying the geological data of the pink mortar with the botanical map of the cypress pine seeds, the investigators managed to narrow their search down to a single small pocket of streets in the suburb of Clontarf, which happened to be just a few miles away from where the body had been discovered. Teams of detectives went door to door through the designated pocket of Clontarf, examining the brickwork of every single home and looking into the yards for cypress pine trees. After hours of searching, they walked up to a vacant single-story house on Moore K7 Road. The house was built with bright red bricks bound together by distinct pale pink mortar. In the front yard, standing right next to the driveway, were two large cypress pine trees. The detectives contacted the property owner, who stated that the house had been rented out to an Eastern European immigrant family just a few months earlier, but the tenants had abruptly packed up all of their belongings and vacated the property on the morning of July 7th, the exact day Graham Thorne vanished. The rental agreement revealed that the tenant's name was Stephen Bradley, a 34-year-old Hungarian immigrant who had moved to Australia several years prior. The landlord also mentioned that the Bradley family owned a small, light-colored Pekingese dog that spent most of its time running around the front yard near the cypress trees. Forensic technicians immediately swarmed the vacant house, pulling up floorboards and vacuuming the carpets. They found traces of the exact same pink mortar dust inside the hallway closet, along with matching Pekingese dog hairs and a missing piece of the gray picnic rug in the garage. But Stephen Bradley, his wife, and his children were completely gone. The police checked international travel logs, harbor manifests, and airline passenger lists across Australia. They discovered that on the evening of July 7th, just hours after the kidnapping, Bradley had moved his family to a temporary hotel before purchasing tickets for a massive passenger ship named the SS Himalaya, which had departed Sydney Harbor just a few days later, bound for Europe. The detectives realized that Bradley was currently out at sea, slowly moving across the Indian Ocean toward international waters, where Australian authorities would have no jurisdiction to arrest him. They immediately contacted the captain of the ship and international police agencies requesting a full block on the vessel. Based on the forensic evidence collected at the Clontarf house, maritime travel records, and subsequent interrogation files from the New South Wales Police Department, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Graham Thorne on the morning of July 7th, 1960. Early that morning, a man sat inside a dark blue sedan parked quietly along the curb of Wellington Street, his eyes fixed on the entrance of the Thorne family's apartment building. He had spent the last 2 weeks reading the newspaper articles about the £100,000 lottery win, memorizing the family's address, and tracking the daily routine of their 8-year-old son. When he saw Graham step onto the sidewalk in his school uniform and begin walking toward the corner, the man started his engine and slowly followed him. He pulled the car up to the curb right next to the boy, rolled down his window, and called him over, claiming to be a friend of his father who had been sent to give him a ride to the Scots College. The boy, trusting the mention of his father, stepped inside the vehicle and shut the door. The man immediately drove to his rented house in Clontarf, led the boy inside, and forced him into a small hallway closet, tying his hands with hemp twine. He walked to the kitchen phone to make the first frantic ransom call to Frida Thorne, demanding £25,000. But as the news of the kidnapping hit the radio stations within the hour, and police roadblocks began appearing across Sydney, the man panicked. He realized the entire city was looking for the boy, and his escape plan was falling apart. He went back to the closet, held a thick wool blanket over the boy's face to stop him from making noise, and suffocated him. He wrapped the body in a silver-gray picnic rug from the garage, bound it with twine, drove to a vacant lot in Seaforth to drop the bundle under a rock ledge, and then rushed back to pack his family's bags before heading straight to the harbor. On October 10th, 1960, the SS Himalaya pulled into the harbor of Colombo, Ceylon, which is modern-day Sri Lanka. The moment the ship docked, local authorities and Australian detectives boarded the vessel, trapped Stephen Bradley inside his cabin, and placed him under arrest. He was extradited back to Sydney, where he stood trial for the murder of Graham Thorne in the Supreme Court of New South Wales. In March of 1961, the jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Bradley was sent to the maximum security Goulburn Gaol, where he remained until he suffered a fatal heart attack and died in prison in 1968. Ensuring the Thorne family's lottery fortune would always be stained by the loss of their only son. A sudden stroke of unimaginable financial luck can inadvertently open the door to a calculation of pure human greed, transforming a regular morning walk to school into a trap. Just like the blind obedience required by a powerful totalitarian state, can be weaponized by a predator who uses a simple official uniform to walk straight through a locked front door in the middle of a crowded city. On a chilly afternoon in November of 1960, a 34-year-old man named Félix Moumié walked through the elegant snow-dusted streets of Geneva, Switzerland. Now, to anyone passing him on the sidewalk, he looked like a wealthy diplomat or a successful businessman, dressed in a sharp wool suit, carrying a heavy leather briefcase, and moving with an absolute sense of purpose. But Félix was not a typical diplomat. He was a radical anti-colonial leader from Cameroon, a brilliant medical doctor who had been forced into exile because he was fighting against French influence in his homeland. And because of his political work buying weapons and securing international funding for his movement, Félix knew he was a marked man. He never took the same route twice. He constantly looked over his shoulder, and he never ate food that hadn't been prepared right in front of him. But on this particular day, as he looked out at the quiet, orderly streets of Geneva, surrounded by the neutral Swiss Alps, Félix allowed himself to relax just a little bit, believing that the international laws of this safe haven would protect him from the shadows of his past. Félix was on his way to a high-end restaurant called L'Argent, located in one of the most affluent districts of the city. He had received an invitation a few days earlier from an older, distinguished-looking man who introduced himself as a prominent Canadian journalist named Paul Thompson. This journalist claimed to be incredibly sympathetic to the African independence movement and promised to write a massive front-page exposé that would expose the dark dealings of the colonial powers to the entire world. For a revolutionary leader trying to gain international support, an article like this was worth more than 1,000,000 francs. So despite his strict rules about meeting strangers, Félix agreed to sit down for a private dinner to share his story, fully believing that a public restaurant in broad daylight was the perfect place to conduct business safely. When Félix stepped inside the restaurant, the air was warm, smelling of rich melted butter, roasted meats, and expensive tobacco. The room was filled with low murmurs of wealthy patrons, the soft clinking of silver cutlery against fine china, and waiters moving smoothly between tables covered in crisp white linen. Sitting at a secluded table in the corner was the older journalist. He had silver hair, wore elegant gold-rimmed glasses, and had a warm, grandfatherly smile that made Félix feel comfortable the moment he shook his hand. The man opened a leather-bound notebook, pulled out an expensive fountain pen, and began asking incredibly detailed, intelligent questions about Cameroon's future, taking careful notes as Félix spoke with his usual burning passion. The waiter approached the table to take their drink orders, and Félix, feeling a bit celebratory about the progress of the interview, ordered a classic glass of Pernod, a strong anise-flavored French liqueur that turns a distinct milky, green color when mixed with water. The older journalist ordered a glass of white wine and continued the conversation smoothly, nodding along with absolute admiration as Félix explained his plans for securing weapons and funding from international allies. The food arrived, and the two men ate, laughed, and discussed international logistics for over an hour, with the older man playing the role of a fascinated reporter to absolute perfection, never once breaking character or showing a single sign of nervousness. Now, as the dinner was winding down, the waiter brought over a small plate with the bill, and the older journalist reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a thick leather wallet, and suddenly gasped. He looked down at the floor, pointing under the table, and told Félix that his expensive fountain pen must have slipped out of his fingers and rolled into the dark space beneath the heavy linen tablecloth. Félix, being a naturally polite and helpful guy, instinctively leaned forward in his chair, ducked his head beneath the edge of the table, and began searching through the shadows on the carpet, trying to locate the missing pen. The search took no more than 5 or 6 seconds before Félix sat back up, shaking his head and apologizing for not being able to find it. The journalist smiled warmly, pulled a spare pen from his pocket, and said it was no big deal at all, thanking Félix for his help. Félix reached across the table, grabbed his glass of Pernod, and swallowed the final remaining ounces of the milky green liquid. He didn't notice any strange texture, and he didn't detect any unusual chemical taste, because the drink's natural, heavy licorice flavor completely overpowered everything else. The two men stood up, shook hands warmly, and promised to stay in touch as the journalist packed up his notebook. Félix walked out of the restaurant feeling incredibly optimistic about the upcoming article, and made the short walk back to his room at the Hotel Grand Pré, completely unaware that his body had just absorbed a massive lethal dose of an odorless, tasteless, heavy metal called thallium. Hours passed, and the sun set over the city, casting the hotel room into deep shadow. Félix lay on his bed, reading through political documents under a small lamp, when a sudden sharp pressure flared up in the center of his abdomen. He sat up, gasping for air as the pressure turned into a blinding, white-hot pain that felt like someone was twisting a rusted knife inside his stomach. He stumbled across the room toward the bathroom, his limbs suddenly feeling incredibly heavy and unresponsive, and began vomiting violently into the porcelain sink. He collapsed onto the cold tile floor, his skin covered in a thick, icy sweat, believing that he was simply suffering from a severe case of food poisoning from something he had eaten at the restaurant earlier that day. By the next morning, the physical destruction of his body had accelerated at a massive rate. Felix dragged himself back to his feet and looked into the bathroom mirror, and what he saw made him freeze. His face was completely pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and when he raised his hand to wipe the cold sweat from his forehead, his fingers came away, covered in thick clumps of black hair. He looked down at the tile floor and realized that his hair was falling out in massive patches, leaving his scalp completely bare in places. Now, because Felix was a fully trained medical doctor who had studied forensic toxicology, the pieces of the puzzle instantly clicked together in his mind. He knew that sudden, massive hair loss, combined with catastrophic organ failure, was the classic, undeniable hallmark of heavy metal poisoning. He realized that this was not an illness, and it was not food poisoning. He had been targeted by a professional assassin. Felix used the last remaining ounces of his physical strength to reach the telephone on the nightstand, dialed the front desk, and gasped out a desperate plea for medical help before collapsing onto the carpet. An ambulance arrived within minutes, and the hotel staff found him unconscious, his body locked in rigid muscles as his nervous system began to shut down entirely. He was rushed to the emergency ward of the Geneva University Hospital, where a team of toxicologists and specialists immediately hooked him up to life support monitors, completely baffled by the speed at which his internal organs were failing. Word of the high-profile political emergency quickly reached the Geneva Police Department, and a veteran detective named Inspector Robert Dubois was dispatched to the hospital room to investigate what looked like a highly suspicious incident. When Dubois stepped inside the room, the scene was grim. The medical monitors were beeping frantically, and the doctors explained that Felix's blood chemistry was completely toxic, showing massive levels of a heavy foreign element that was systematically destroying his nervous system. The police initially began looking into internal rivalries within Felix's own political party, setting up interviews with his regular associates, and checking the hotel logs for any suspicious visitors who might have slipped into his room during the night. But just as the detectives were preparing to launch a wide-scale audit of the local political factions, Felix Moumier suddenly opened his eyes. Despite the immense physical trauma and the fact that his organs were actively failing, his mind remained completely clear and lucid. He looked directly at Inspector Dubois, his voice a raspy whisper through his cracked lips, and he pointed his finger toward the window. He told the detective that the red herrings about his political rivals were a complete waste of time. He stated clearly that he had been poisoned during his dinner at the restaurant the previous afternoon, and he named the older Canadian journalist Paul Thompson as the person who had orchestrated the attack. Felix provided a precise, detailed physical description of the man, including his height, his gold-rimmed glasses, and the heavy leather journal he carried, before slipping back into a deep coma. Inspector Dubois leapt into action, dispatching a team of officers back to the high-end restaurant to secure the table, seize the glasses, and interview the staff. The waiter who had served the two men confirmed the interaction, stating that the older man had paid the bill in cash and had left immediately after Felix drank the last of his Pernod. But when the detectives checked the city's hotel registries and border checkpoints for a Canadian journalist named Paul Thompson, they found absolutely nothing. The name was completely fake, a ghost identity used to slip through the neutral country without leaving a paper trail. The Swiss authorities launched a massive coordinated manhunt across the city, checking train stations and airports. But the older man had already vanished across the border into France, leaving the detective with a room full of toxic medical reports and a dying political leader. Based on declassified intelligence files from the French National Police and the declassified records of the Swiss Federal Archives, here is a reconstruction of what actually happened to Felix Roland Moumier in November of 1960. The older man sitting across the table at the restaurant was not a Canadian journalist named Paul Thompson, and he had no interest in writing an article about African independence. His real name was William Bechtel, a 57-year-old veteran operative and assassin for the SDECE, the French Secret Service. Bechtel had been sent to Geneva on a state-sanctioned execution mission codenamed Operation Homo, ordered by top-level intelligence directors in Paris, who viewed Felix's weapon-buying trips as a direct threat to French colonial interests. Bechtel had spent weeks tracking Felix's movements across Europe, studying his habits, and realizing that the leader was incredibly paranoid about his security. He knew he could never get close enough to use a traditional weapon, so he decided to use a highly concentrated liquid dose of thallium, a chemical compound so toxic and unnoticeable that it was known in the intelligence world as the poisoner's poison. Bechtel bought a premium leather journal, fabricated the journalist identity, and used the promise of a major news article to lure Felix into the public restaurant, knowing that the busy environment would make the leader drop his guard. When the bill arrived at the end of the meal, Bechtel purposely dropped his expensive fountain pen onto the carpet beneath the long white linen tablecloth, knowing that Felix's polite nature would force him to lean down and search for it. The moment Felix's head disappeared beneath the edge of the table, Bechtel smoothly reached into his vest pocket, pulled out a small glass vial, and emptied the liquid thallium directly into the remaining milky green Pernod in Felix's glass. The chemical dissolved instantly into the alcohol without changing its color, consistency, or smell. Bechtel calmly tucked the empty vial back into his pocket, smiled as Felix sat back up, and watched with absolute satisfaction as the leader swallowed the lethal trap before walking out of the restaurant to catch a waiting train back to Paris. On November 3rd, 1960, after spending days locked on life support machines, 34-year-old Felix Roland Moumier suffered complete cardiovascular collapse and died inside his hospital bed. The Swiss authorities officially ruled his death a homicide by thallium poisoning and issued an international arrest warrant for William Bechtel. But the French government completely refused to cooperate with the investigation, keeping Bechtel hidden inside their military intelligence network and burying the declassified files deep inside the state archives to protect the secret. Service from international exposure, William Bechtel successfully eluded justice for over 3 decades, living a quiet, comfortable life in France under the protection of his handlers. It wasn't until 1992, 32 years after the murder, that he was accidentally tracked down and arrested during a trip to Germany. He was extradited to Switzerland to finally face trial for the assassination. But by that point, Bechtel was an 85-year-old man, and the French government exerted massive, overwhelming diplomatic and political pressure on the Swiss courts, claiming that the statute of limitations had passed and that the trial would destroy international relations. The Swiss judges ultimately caved to the pressure, dropping all criminal charges and allowing Bechtel to walk out of the courtroom a free man. He returned to France and died of natural causes inside his own home, meaning the state-sanctioned execution of Felix Moumier officially went completely unpunished. A deep-cover intelligence operative can use a fabricated identity and a single moment of distraction to eliminate a target and disappear into the safety of a protecting state. But while some governments deploy faceless assassins to carry out secret executions in foreign cities, others rely on an overwhelming display of military force to instantly block off an entire rural town, burying the physical truth of a mysterious event beneath a mountain of official denials. In the first week of February, 1963, a 21-year-old woman named Helen Klaben sat inside a crowded, steam-fogged diner in Fairbanks, Alaska, watching the heavy winter snow pack up against the glass windows. Helen was a native of Brooklyn, New York, who had left her city life behind to move to the remote Northern Territory to work as a commercial draftsman for an engineering firm. But after months of enduring the dark, freezing, sub-zero Alaskan winter, she had decided she was completely done with the cold and wanted to return home to her family, who were currently living down in San Francisco, California. Because her bank account was nearly empty after paying her remaining expenses, she could not afford a standard commercial airline ticket, so she decided to place a small, handwritten index card on a public bulletin board at the local airport. The note stated that she was looking for a private pilot who was already planning to fly south and would be willing to give her a ride in exchange for splitting the basic cost of the aviation fuel. Within a day, her message was answered by a 42-year-old amateur pilot and professional mechanic named Ralph Flores. Ralph had just completed a temporary maintenance contract in Fairbanks and was preparing to fly his personal aircraft, a single-engine fabric-covered Howard DGA-15 plane, back to his home and his family in San Bruno, California. Ralph was a deeply religious man, a devout Mormon, and a father of 6 children who possessed an intense, completely unshakable confidence in his own mechanical skills and flying abilities, repeatedly assuring Helen that his plane was in flawless running condition. Helen looked at the rugged private plane and despite having absolutely no experience flying in small private aircraft, handed over her remaining cash, packed her suitcases, and climbed into the passenger seat next to Ralph. On the cold morning of February 4th, 1963, the small Howard plane lifted off from the ice-covered runway in Fairbanks, climbing slowly into the heavy, overcast gray sky and heading south toward the vast, unmapped mountain ranges of the Yukon Territory in northern Canada. For the first few hours of the journey, the flight proceeded completely as planned, with Helen looking down through the cockpit windows at the endless expanse of dark green pine trees, frozen rivers, and jagged white mountain peaks passing thousands of feet below, while the single engine maintained a steady, loud drone inside. The cramped cabin. Ralph navigated using visual landmarks, following the basic path of the Alaska Highway stretching out like a thin black ribbon through the white wilderness. But as they flew deeper into the remote Canadian wilderness, hundreds of miles away from any major town airport or survival base, the clear air completely vanished. A massive, blinding winter storm gridlocked the entire region, dropping the visibility to absolute zero within a matter of seconds and trapping the small aircraft inside a thick wall of gray clouds. The temperature outside plummeted instantly, and a heavy, thick glaze of clear ice began to rapidly build up along the leading edges of the wings, destroying the plane's aerodynamic lift and causing the control stick to become incredibly heavy and sluggish in Ralph's hands. Ralph frantically adjusted the fuel mixture and pushed the throttle forward, trying to force the aircraft to climb above the storm clouds to find clear air. But the high altitude and freezing temperature caused the engine to choke and sputter, losing power as the violent high-altitude winds slammed the plane downward toward the sharp mountain ridges. Helen gripped the metal frame of her seat, watching the frost creep across the dashboard instruments, until suddenly, the thick cloud cover broke for a fraction of a second, revealing the jagged tops of the pine trees rising up directly through the white mist in front of the propeller. Ralph screamed for Helen to brace her body, pulling back on the controls with all his strength, but a second later, the aluminum wings sliced through the upper branches of the timber, and the small plane plummeted straight into the side of a Stoddy 5, remote, snow-covered mountain tearing through the heavy trees before coming to a violent, crushing halt in a deep drift. When Helen finally opened her eyes inside the shattered, twisted cabin of the plane, the loud roar of the engine was completely gone, replaced by a heavy, dead silence and the faint sound of the wind whistling through the torn metal sheets of the fuselage. The nose of the plane was completely crushed into the frozen ground, and the sharp, chemical smell of leaking aviation fuel immediately filled the freezing air, making Helen panic as she struggled to move her body to see if the wreckage was about to catch fire. She tried to lift herself up, but a sharp, sickening flash of pain shot through her left arm, and she realized the bone was completely fractured and dangling uselessly at her side. And when she tried to pull her legs out from the wreckage, her left foot was completely wedged beneath the crushed steel frame of the dashboard. She looked over at the pilot's seat and saw Ralph slumped forward over the control wheel, his face completely covered in blood from a deep, jagged gash across his forehead, and his mouth swelling rapidly from what looked like a severely broken jaw. Helen called out his name over and over, her voice cracking in the sub-zero air until New York and California felt like another world completely. Finally, Ralph groaned, slowly pushing himself up from the dashboard and wiping the blood from his eyes so he could look around the destroyed cockpit. They had survived the initial impact of the crash, but as they looked through the shattered windows at the endless miles of white mountains stretching out to the horizon, they realized they were stranded in one of the most hostile, uninhabited wilderness regions on the continent, with the temperature outside the plane rapidly dropping to 40 degrees, below zero. Ralph managed to crawl through the broken windshield into the chest-deep snowdrifts outside, using his good arm to slowly pry the twisted metal off Helen's trapped leg and dragging her out of the crushed cabin before wrapping her in the few spare wool blankets they had packed in the cargo bay. He laid her down on a small, thin decorative mattress inside the remaining covered section of the rear fuselage, which was the only part of the plane that had stayed relatively intact during the crash, providing a crude shelter against the freezing wind. Ralph then began fumbling through their packed travel supplies to see what kind of emergency gear they had on board. And his heart completely sank when he realized they had absolutely no survival equipment, no winter snowshoes, no signaling flares, no matches, and no heavy cold weather survival coats because they had planned for a quick routine, cross-country trip. Their entire food supply for the entire journey consisted of exactly 4 small cans of sardines, 2 cans of tuna, a single box of saltine crackers, and a can of fruit salad that Helen had bought at the terminal as a quick snack. Ralph used a pocket knife to split open the first small can of sardines on the night of the crash, giving Helen a single piece of fish and taking one tiny piece for himself, while they used an empty tin cup to gather clean snow from outside. The cabin door, melting it down into drinking water over a tiny, precarious fire that Ralph managed to start using a spark from the plane's battery, a few drops of engine oil, and some dried pine needles. By the end of the first week on the mountainside, the final crumbs of the crackers and the last drops of the fruit salad were completely gone, leaving them with absolutely nothing to eat as the brutal winter winds continued to scream through the trees outside. Back in the United States and Canada, when the Howard plane failed to arrive at its scheduled refueling stop in Whitehorse, the Royal Canadian Air Force and the Civil Air Patrol launched a massive coordinated search and rescue operation. Dozens of military aircraft took off into the freezing winter sky, flying grid patterns over thousands of square miles of the rugged Yukon Territory, looking for any sign of a downed plane or a thin column of smoke rising from the forest. Helen's family in Brooklyn held regular prayer vigils, constantly calling the rescue base for updates, while Ralph's wife and 6 children in California waited by the telephone for any news. But the storm had covered the entire mountain range in a fresh, thick layer of heavy white snow, completely burying the small wreckage of the plane and making it look like any other boulder on the rocky slopes. After 3 weeks of continuous flights through dangerous winter weather without finding a single piece of debris or picking up any emergency radio signals, the military officials determined that no one could possibly survive 40 below zero temperatures without gear. They officially called off the active search operation, notifying the families that the plane was lost at sea or buried in the wilderness and that the passengers were presumed dead. On the mountain, weeks began to blend together into a long, agonizing blur of intense starvation and extreme cold, with Helen staying completely confined to the thin mattress inside the metal fuselage because her broken arm had swollen to twice its normal size and her injured left foot had begun to turn a distinct dark purple color from the advanced stages of frostbite. To keep her mind from sliding into absolute insanity and despair, Helen fumbled through her luggage with her one good hand and pulled out the only 3 books she had brought with her from Alaska, a small pocket Bible, a book of classic poetry, and a thick fiction novel. She sat huddled beneath the freezing wool blankets for hours every single day, reading the same exact pages out loud to herself over and over again in the dark, trying her best to ignore the constant throbbing pain in her fractured limbs and the sickening hollow ache in her stomach. Outside the plane, Ralph spent his days dragging heavy pine branches through the deep snow drifts to maintain the tiny fire, his broken jaw completely locked in place by the swelling, which forced him to live purely on the melted snow water that he boiled over the hot coals. On several occasions during the 3rd and 4th weeks of their isolation, the low, distant drone of a regular commercial plane would echo across the mountain valley, causing Ralph to frantically throw green pine needles onto the fire to create a thick pillar of black smoke. But every single time, the aircraft would simply fly straight past their mountain, completely unable to see the tiny speck of white metal hidden deep beneath the dense, snow-covered forest canopy. By the middle of March, 40 days had passed since the Howard plane had crashed into the mountain, and both Helen and Ralph had reached the absolute vertical limits of human physical survival, their bodies completely emaciated after losing dozens of pounds of muscle, and their skin turning a translucent waxy gray color from the total lack of nutrition. Helen's frostbitten toes had completely lost all physical sensation, turning solid black and beginning to decay inside her leather boots. And she knew that if they did not find a way to signal for help within the next few days, she would die on the mattress. Ralph looked at his small pocket calendar, realized it was his young daughter's birthday back in California, and decided he could no longer sit by the wreckage and wait to freeze to death. He turned to Helen and whispered through his swollen jaw that he was going to walk down the mountain to find an open space where someone could see them. He used a thick, sturdy pine branch as a makeshift crutch, said goodbye to Helen, and began an agonizing, slow trek down the steep, icy slope of the mountain, dragging his frostbitten legs through the waist-deep snowdrifts for hours, until he finally reached a wide, open clearing along a frozen riverbed far below the tree line. He stood in the center of the massive sheet of white ice, took a deep breath, and began using his heavy boots and his wooden stick to painstakingly stamp out 3 massive letters into the deep crust of the snow, packing the drifts down over and over again until the letters SOS stretched over 100 feet across the ice, perfectly visible from thousands of feet in the air. On the afternoon of March 25th, 1963, a Canadian bush pilot named Chuck Hamilton was flying a routine transport mission over the rugged, unmapped Yukon wilderness when he happened to glance down out of his side window at the frozen river valley below. He noticed a strange geometric pattern in the snow that did not look like any natural ice formation. And when he dropped his altitude and flew his plane low over the tree line, he clearly saw the massive letters SOS stamped into the riverbed with a thin wisp of gray smoke rising from the mountain slope a mile away. Hamilton immediately radioed the exact coordinates to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Rescue Base, and within a few hours, a heavy rescue helicopter rounded the edge of the mountain, peaks its rotors, kicking up massive clouds of white powder as it touched down in the clearing. The rescue team climbed up the slope to the crushed wreckage of the Howard plane, threw open the broken cabin door, and found Helen Claiborne still huddled beneath her wool blankets, holding her poetry book in her good hand. Completely unable to walk, but miraculously alive after 49 days of pure starvation in the sub-zero wilderness. Both Helen and Ralph Flores were carried into the helicopter and rushed to the Whitehorse General Hospital, where they were treated for severe exposure, muscle atrophy, and advanced frostbite. Doctors were completely stunned by their condition, stating that they were within just a few days of total organ failure. But through intensive medical care and several surgeries, they both ultimately made a full recovery, with Helen's story of survival becoming a global sensation, later being documented in her personal memoir. Human endurance can somehow survive the absolute coldest and most desolate margins of the earth, when nature strikes by accident, with a simple stamped message in the snow being enough to reverse a declaration of death. But while some tharmhua are caused by the unpredictable forces of a winter storm in the wilderness, others are the direct result of human hubris, where a massive concrete structure is slowly filled with millions of tons of water, despite explicit warnings from geologists that the very mountain above it is completely unstable. On a crisp October evening in 1963, a 32-year-old factory worker named Olivo Tezza walked down the main cobblestone street of Longarone, a small bustling mountain town nestled in the deep Piave Valley of northern Italy. Now Olivo was looking forward to getting home because his wife had prepared a hot dinner, and the local men were already gathering inside the town's central tavern to watch a highly anticipated soccer match between Real Madrid and Glasgow Rangers on the brand new television set. So, as he walked, he nodded to the local shopkeepers who were stacking wooden crates outside their storefronts. And he watched a group of young children playing a game of tag between the tightly packed brick buildings, completely unaware of the mountain that rose directly above their homes. But as Olivo looked up toward the narrow mountain gorge that towered over the northern edge of the valley, he could see the massive curved concrete wall of the Vajont Dam cutting a clean white arc straight across the dark sky. This structure was literally the tallest dam in the entire world at the time, standing over 262 meters high, and it had become a symbol of immense national pride and corporate success for the entire Italian state. And even though the giant concrete barrier held back an absolute ocean of over 115 million cubic meters of water directly above their heads, the local residents had become completely accustomed to its presence, treating the engineering marvel like it was just another permanent, harmless part of the alpine landscape. Now, what the ordinary citizens of Longarone did not know was that the massive mountain anchoring the left side of the deep reservoir, a giant limestone peak known as Monte Toc, was kind of showing some very unusual signs of internal instability. In the local Venetian dialect, the word toc literally translated to a piece or something crazy, because for generations, the old woodcutters and mountain shepherds had passed down oral stories about how the soil on that specific mountain had a dangerous habit of shifting and sliding after the autumn rains. But the high-powered corporate executives and the elite engineers from the private electricity monopoly known as SAID completely brushed those ancient local legends off as nothing more than unscientific folklore that couldn't possibly compete with modern concrete design. So the company continued with their massive industrial project, slowly filling the deep valley behind the concrete wall with water to test the reservoir's ultimate capacity and generate massive amounts of electricity for the industrial cities down south. But by the summer of 1963, some very real and tangible problems began to show up on the slopes of Monte Toc that were completely impossible for the workers to ignore. Farmers working on the high alpine pastures noticed that large, deep cracks were beginning to tear open across the green grass. and several old pine trees were tilting at bizarre angles, looking like they were kind of tiptoeing down this mountain. And then, small earth tremors began to vibrate through the stone foundations of the homes in the valley, rattling the teacups on the kitchen counters and causing the local farm dogs to bark nervously into the dark woods. Now, as the cracks on the mountain continued to widen, the engineers at SOD did not completely ignore the data. Instead, they decided to build a massive, scaled-down physical model of the entire reservoir inside a specialized laboratory in the nearby town of Nove. They wanted to simulate what would happen if a piece of the mountain fell into the water. But the technicians deliberately constructed the model using smooth wooden boards and solid concrete layers to represent the slope of Monte Toc, completely omitting the slippery, delicate internal layers of clay that the geologists had documented. So when they threw gravel into the model lake, it only generated a tiny, harmless ripple, which gave the company directors the false scientific confidence they needed to ignore the warning signs and continue filling the real reservoir to its dangerous limit. Now, a local journalist named Tina Merlin, who worked for a small independent newspaper called L'Unità, began interviewing the mountain farmers and collecting data on these bizarre geological changes. She realized that something was completely wrong with the structural integrity of the project, and she published a series of bold articles warning the public that filling the reservoir was actively destabilizing the base of the mountain and could trigger a catastrophic failure that would threaten the entire valley below. But instead of pausing the operations or investigating her claims, the powerful corporate executives at SAID were so completely furious about the negative publicity that they actually used their immense political influence to sue Tina Merlin for spreading false rumors and disrupting public order. But the state court ultimately acquitted the journalist after realizing she was simply reporting the documented facts. Yet her detailed warnings were completely pushed aside by the government authorities who were in the middle of negotiating a massive deal to nationalize the country's electricity grid. So the company kept the water levels high, desperate to prove that the dam was fully operational at its maximum limit so they could secure a massive corporate payout from the government before the state took total control of the infrastructure. And by the first week of October, the engineers on duty at the dam site noticed that the giant mass of earth on Monte Toc had accelerated its downward movement, shifting by over 20 centimeters every single day. On the night of October 9th, 1963, the situation inside the mountain valley reached a critical tipping point as the ground continued to shift. Inside the local tavern in Longarone, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the sound of men cheering as the soccer match broadcasted over the television, while up in the mountain villages of Erto and Casso, most families had already tucked their children into bed and turned off their oil lamps. But inside the main control room located right at the edge of the dam gorge, a young engineer named Gian Mario Rossi was staring at his instruments with an absolute sense of dread. He could see that the measurement lines on his graphs were spiking violently, showing that the entire flank of the mountain was now moving at an uncontrollable speed toward the edge of the deep water. So Rossi frantically picked up the telephone and called the company's chief director, Alberico Biadene, who was sitting inside a comfortable private office in Venice, miles away from the danger zone. Rossi shouted into the receiver, "The markers are moving too fast. The ground is cracking open up. Here we need to alert the towns immediately." But Biadene, who didn't want to spark a massive public panic that would completely ruin the upcoming government sale, simply told the young engineer to stay calm and remain at his post. Biadene replied flatly, "Do not cause a scene, Rossi. The water is under control. Just monitor the instruments and avoid making any drastic decisions." Now, right around 10:39 p.m., the true nature of the corporate cover-up and the complete failure of the engineering project collided in a single catastrophic moment under the moonlight. Suddenly, a massive block of Monte Toc, an absolute mountain of earth limestone rock, and entire forests, measuring over 260 million cubic meters, completely sheared off its base and collapsed into the reservoir all at once. The giant landmass hit the deep water at a staggering speed of over 68 miles per hour, creating a force so immense that it completely filled the entire basin and displaced the massive body of water in less than 40 seconds. And this massive displacement created an unprecedented wave of water, a giant mega tsunami that rose over 250 meters into the night air, completely dwarfing the concrete towers of the dam itself. The wall of water cresting over the concrete wall did not even damage the structure, which was built so solidly that it stood perfectly intact. But the water had nowhere else to go, except straight down into the narrow, rocky gorge leading directly toward the sleeping towns of the Piave Valley below. And as the wave plummeted down the steep cliffs, it generated a massive air blast ahead of it, a shockwave so powerful that it carried the physical force of a nuclear blast, ripping the roofs off the stone houses and creating a vacuum that literally sucked the air out of people's lungs before the liquid even touched them. But then, the absolute wall of water hit the town of Longarone with a deafening roar that sounded like a dozen freight trains crashing together at maximum speed. In less than 4 minutes, the entire community, along with the smaller outlying villages of Pirago, Rivalta, Villanova, and Fae, was completely erased from the face of the earth as the wave pulverized the brick buildings, flipped massive stone churches upside down, and dragged thousands of tons of mud and debris across the valley floor. So, when the sun finally rose over the mountains, the following morning, the rescue workers who rushed to the scene did not find a damaged town filled with broken houses. Instead, they found an absolute flat plain of gray mud, wet gravel, and giant river stones, where a vibrant community of over 2,000 people had been sleeping just hours before. And as the initial rescue columns and military personnel began to arrive at the edge of the valley just after dawn, they were completely stunned by the bizarre physical anomalies left behind by the catastrophic blast wave. They found cars wrapped tightly around the branches of high pine trees miles away from the road, and many of the bodies recovered from the thick mud had their clothing completely stripped off, a direct result of the immense sudden atmospheric pressure change that had literally torn the fabric from their bodies in a fraction of a second. So the soldiers could only wander through the flat wasteland in absolute silence, carrying small wooden markers to plant in the wet gray sludge wherever they located a piece of debris or a sign of a former home. The initial reports broadcasted by the state media attempted to frame the entire event as an unpredictable natural disaster, a tragic act of God, or a sudden geological freak accident that no amount of human science could have possibly foreseen. But as independent investigators and prosecutors began digging into the locked storage rooms and private archives of the SAID Corporation, they uncovered a massive paper trail of hidden memos, suppressed geological reports, and confidential notebooks that changed the nature of the case completely. They found that several top executives and engineers had been fully aware of the ancient paleo slide on Monte Toc since 1959, when a top geologist named Eduardo Semenza had explicitly warned them that the entire mountain was a giant, sleeping landmass that would inevitably break loose if water levels inside the reservoir were raised too high. Based on these declassified court documents from the Belluno Criminal Inquiry and the historical engineering logs, here is a reconstruction of what the corporate executives were doing in the final hours leading up to the disaster. Inside the polished corporate offices, directors like Alberico Biadin and top engineering consultants had been holding private meetings where they openly discussed the rapid movement of the mountain slope. They realized that the earth was sliding because the high water table was creating massive hydrostatic pressure inside the rock layers. So they decided to run a dangerous, unverified experiment by rapidly lowering the water level in the reservoir, hoping that the change in pressure would slow the mountain down. But they didn't realize that pulling the water away would actually remove the physical support anchoring the base of the slope, causing the massive internal layers of clay to slick over and accelerate the collapse effectively, triggering the exact landslide they were trying to prevent while keeping the local towns completely in the dark. During the long legal proceedings, the high-priced defense lawyers hired by the private corporation spent months trying to frame the event as a completely unpredictable natural tragedy that was accelerated by a deep, hidden subaquifer that no amount of engineering could have detected. They brought in their own team of paid scientific experts who stood in front of the judges and argued that the final catastrophic slide was a sudden freak acceleration that contradicted all existing geological models at the time. But the prosecution countered this argument by pulling out the company's internal private telegrams, showing that the directors had actively monitored the increasing speed of the landslide for weeks and had consciously chosen to keep the valley towns completely in the dark to protect their massive financial merger. Now, the absolute public outrage following the discovery of these hidden documents forced the Italian government to launch a full-scale criminal prosecution against the surviving executives and engineers. To prevent a massive public riot from disrupting the legal proceedings, the High Court moved the entire trial away from the affected region of Belluno all the way down to the city of L'Aquila, where the courtroom was heavily guarded by military police. During the long, tense trial in 1968, prosecutors presented the suppressed geological maps and the internal company telegrams, proving that the corporate desire to secure a government profit had directly resulted in the preventable execution of an entire community. In 1969, the High Court handed down its final judgments, finding several of the key corporate directors guilty of multiple charges of negligence, causing a catastrophic landslide and mass manslaughter. The chief director of the project, Alberico Baiadini, was officially convicted and sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, though his term was later reduced to just 2 years on appeal due to his advanced age and health issues. Another top engineering executive named Mario Pansini, who had been fully consumed by immense guilt and psychological trauma over his role in the cover-up, actually took his own life inside his home just days before he was scheduled to testify in front of the judge. The survivors of the disaster spent decades fighting for financial compensation from the state, but no amount of money could ever fix the gray, rocky plain where the families of Longarone had been wiped out in a matter of seconds. The corporate desire for profit can turn a massive engineering marvel into a silent weapon that completely erases an entire town while the residents are sleeping in their beds. But while some plans are ruined by the immense, uncontrollable weight of a falling mountain, others are brought down by a hilariously mundane mistake left behind on a simple cardboard surface during an elite multi-million-dollar heist. On the morning of August 13, 1963, a cattle farmer named John Maris walked along a narrow dirt track in Buckinghamshire, England, checking on the livestock grazing in his pastures. The fields were bordered by thick briar hedges, and the only sound across the countryside was the low, steady chewing of the cows. As John approached the edge of his property, he looked across a wire fence at Leatherslade Farm, a remote single-story house that had been purchased by a group of strangers just a few weeks prior. The windows of the farmhouse were completely covered with heavy woolen blankets, blocking any view of the interior, and the gravel driveway was scored with deep, fresh tire tracks from heavy trucks. John noticed a large yellow moving van sitting under the shade of some oak trees. Its back doors slightly open, but there was absolutely no sign of life anywhere on the property. He stood by the fence for several minutes, watching the silent house, before turning around to return to his tractor, feeling a subtle, lingering suspicion about the secretive new neighbors who had suddenly arrived in his isolated rural district. Just 5 days earlier, the biggest train robbery in the history of the United Kingdom had completely paralyzed the British government. In the midnight darkness of August 8, 1963, the Royal Mail train traveling from Glasgow to London was moving smoothly down the tracks near a desolate rail crossing known as Sears Crossing. The train carried 70 postal workers who were manually sorting mail bags inside the rear carriages. But the second carriage, directly behind the locomotive, held an absolute fortune in high-value banknotes, destined for the banks of London. As the train rounded a bend, the locomotive driver, a veteran rail worker named Jack Mills, looked out his window and saw a bright red light glowing on the signal gantry ahead of him, indicating an immediate emergency on the tracks. Jack pulled the heavy iron brake handle, bringing the massive steam train to a complete halt in the middle of the pitch-black fields, completely unaware that there was no emergency on the line. A group of 15 masked men stepped out from the shadows of the railway embankment, moving with absolute military precision. They had cut the main telephone wires running alongside the tracks, and they used a portable battery pack and a black leather glove to physically cover up the green signal bulb while lighting up the red light to trick the driver. 2 men climbed into the locomotive cab, struck Jack Mills over the head with an iron bar when he tried to resist, and forced the assistant driver to uncouple the engine and the high-value coach from the rest of the train. The robbers drove the detached carriages a half-mile down the track to Bridego Bridge, where a fleet of trucks was waiting in the darkness. They smashed through the secure wooden doors of the carriage, forced the terrified guards to lie face down on the floor, and systematically loaded 128 sacks containing over 2,600,000 pounds in cash into their vehicles before speeding away into the night. Scotland Yard immediately launched the most massive, expensive manhunt in the history of the country under the personal direction of Detective Superintendent Gerald MacArthur. Elite teams of detectives swarmed the railway tracks, checked airport passenger registries, and monitored every major harbor across the English Channel, believing that an organized gang of this scale would immediately attempt to fly to Spain or France to launder the cash. The police department offered an unprecedented financial reward for any information filling the morning newspapers with details of the stolen vehicles and the layout of the mail train. Meanwhile, back in Buckinghamshire, John Maris was listening to the radio reports inside his kitchen when he realized the red trucks described by the announcers matched the heavy vehicles he had seen hidden beneath the trees at Leatherslade Farm just a mile away, and he immediately picked up his telephone to contact the local police station. A local police constable named John Woolley was dispatched to investigate the tip, driving his small patrol car down the long gravel track toward the isolated farmhouse. When he stepped out of his vehicle, the property was completely deserted, and the yellow moving van had vanished from the yard. Officer Woolley walked up to the back door, found it was entirely unlocked, and stepped inside the dark kitchen where he was immediately hit with the smell of stale tobacco, raw grease, and rotting food. The house looked like it had been abandoned in a moment of absolute frantic panic, with sleeping bags thrown across the floors, boxes of eggs cracked open on the counters, and rows of empty beer bottles filling the trash bins. As Woolley walked into the main dining room, his eyes fell directly upon a large wooden table sitting in the center of the space, and right there on the tabletop was a domestic board game. It was a regular copy of Monopoly, sitting perfectly intact among the dirty plates and the half-eaten loaves of bread. Based on the forensic evidence collected at the farmhouse and the subsequent statements gathered by investigators, here is a reconstruction of what happened inside Leatherslade Farm in the days following the Great Train Heist. After fleeing the railway bridge, the 15-man gang drove directly to the remote property, which they had purchased through a shell company specifically to use as a secure bunker to hide from the initial police searches. They pulled their vehicles into the barn, dumped the 128 mailbags onto the floor, and spent 24 hours straight cutting open the canvas sacks and sorting the crisp banknotes into neat bundles of 20 pounds. They had over 2 million pounds in cash sitting in massive piles on the floorboards, but they knew they could not leave the farm because the police had set up rows of strict roadblocks on every single highway leading out of the county. The gang was completely trapped inside the house for 3 days straight, forced to keep the woolen blankets pinned over the windows to avoid attracting the attention of the local farmers. The air inside the small rooms became incredibly thick and hot, and as the initial excitement of the robbery began to fade, an intense claustrophobic paranoia settled over the men. They started arguing over the division of the money, smoking chain smokes and pacing the hallways, desperately trying to pass the time while listening to the police sirens echoing across the distant roads. To break the suffocating tension, one of the younger robbers fumbled through a closet, pulled out a box containing a Monopoly board game, and set it down on the large dining room table. The men gathered around the table, pulled out the plastic playing pieces, and began rolling the dice on the cardboard layout, laughing loudly as they decided to replace the toy paper money included in the box with actual crisp banknotes from their stolen mailbags. They spent hours sitting in the dim light, passing the property cards, handling the dice, and touching the cardboard surface with their bare hands, completely forgot about their professional criminal training in the middle of the game. But right as the game was winding down, a lookout, standing by the edge of the blanketed window, shouted that a local tractor was moving slowly down the dirt lane outside, and the entire room erupted into pure panic. Someone screamed, "The police are down the road! We have to get out of here right now!" The criminals shoved the millions of pounds into their personal suitcases, abandoned their provisions, and scrambled out the back door toward their personal cars, leaving the property in a massive rush. Before fleeing the area, the gang leader handed a thick bundle of cash to a local associate who had been hired to look after the property, instructing him to spend the evening scrubbing the entire house with chemical bleach and then setting the farmhouse completely on fire to turn all the physical evidence into ash. The associate took the money, looked at the dangerous police roadblocks filling the neighborhood, and decided he didn't want to get caught carrying cans of gasoline near a crime scene, so he simply pocketed the cash and fled the county, leaving the farmhouse completely intact for the police to find. When Detective Chief Superintendent John Fletcher of Scotland Yard's Fingerprint Bureau arrived at Leatherslade Farm, he ignored the abandoned trucks and the empty mailbags, focusing his entire attention on the dining room table. He brought in specialized laboratory technicians who used chemical iodine vapors and silver nitrate powders to carefully dust the cardboard surface of the Monopoly board, the small plastic tokens, and the edges of the property cards. Because the gang members had been sitting in a hot, sweat-filled room for hours without wearing their leather gloves, their fingers had left behind perfect, clean sweat oils on the porous paper surfaces. The lab technicians successfully lifted dozens of flawless palm prints and latent fingerprints directly from the board game, providing the police with an absolute forensic map of the entire crew. The fingerprint files were rushed back to the Central Archive in London, where computers matched the sweat marks to a list of known professional thieves from the South London underworld. Cops immediately identified the ringleaders, including a high-profile criminal named Bruce Reynolds, along with his closest associates, Buster Edwards and Ronnie Biggs. Armed with the exact names and faces of the gang, Scotland Yard launched an aggressive, targeted dragnet across the city, raiding safe houses and cornering the suspects one by one before they could manage to launder their share of the city. Cash. Within less than 6 months of John Maris, noticing the yellow van, nearly the entire 15-man crew was behind bars, standing in front of a judge at the Buckingham Assizes Court. In April of 1964, the historic trial concluded with the judge handing down some of the harshest sentences in the history of British law, giving 7 of the primary robbers 30 years each in a maximum security prison for their role in the assault on Jack Mills and the theft of the Royal Mail. Over 90% of the £2,600,000 was never officially recovered by the authorities, having been buried in hidden caches across the countryside or funneled to underground networks before the arrests took place. The Monopoly board game itself was retained by Scotland Yard as a permanent, historical artifact of the investigation. A ridiculous testament to how a multi-million-dollar military-style heist was completely undone because a crew of elite thieves got bored and decided to play a family game with their bare hands. A single set of clean fingerprints left behind on a cardboard toy is enough to destroy the most meticulously planned train robbery in history, sending a Sungsar criminal network straight to a prison cell for 30 long years. But while some investigations are solved by the distinct sweat marks left on a table in an abandoned English farmhouse, other mysteries begin in the absolute freezing isolation of the far northern tundra, where an entire group of searchers can only watch as an ordinary afternoon sky is suddenly ripped open by a screaming ball of fire that plunges into the dark woods below. On a damp October evening in 1963, a 32-year-old textile factory worker named Olivo Tezza walked down the main cobblestone street of Longarone, a busy growing valley town nestled deep in the Alpine foothills of northern Italy. The air smelled of wet stone wood smoke and roasted chestnuts, and the streets were filled with the loud, echoing sounds of neighborhood children playing a final game of tag between the stone buildings before their mothers called them inside for dinner. Olivo adjusted the heavy collar of his canvas work jacket and waved to a local shopkeeper named Bruno, who was busy stacking heavy wooden crates of apples outside his storefront. Olivo stopped for a brief moment to ask Bruno if he was going to the Central Town Tavern later that evening, because the local men had been talking all week about a massive soccer match between Real Madrid and Glasgow Rangers that was going to be broadcast live on the neighborhood's only television set. Bruno wiped his hands on his apron and smiled, saying he would definitely be there right after he finished locking up the shop, because nobody wanted to miss a game of that scale. Olivo nodded, feeling a familiar sense of comfort in the steady, predictable rhythms of his hometown, and he began walking toward his small apartment where his wife Maria was already stirring a copper pot of hot polenta over the kitchen hearth. As Olivo walked past the central piazza, he didn't bother to look up toward the narrow mountain gorge that towered over the northern edge of the valley, and neither did anyone else in the town. For over 3 years, a massive, gleaming white arc of solid concrete had spanned the entire gap between the steep mountain cliffs, cutting a sharp modern line directly across the alpine sky. This structure was the famous Vajont Dam, and at exactly 262 meters high, it was literally the tallest dam in the entire world, a marvel of modern industrial technology that the entire country viewed as a proud symbol of progress and economic success. The giant concrete barrier held back an absolute ocean of over 115 million cubic meters of deep water directly above the Thung Lung, but the local citizens had become completely used to its presence, treating the structural wall like it was just another harmless permanent part of the Rocky Mountain landscape. The project had brought dozens of steady construction jobs and new electrical lines to the region, and even though old-timers occasionally muttered about the sheer weight of the water sitting above their roofs, most folks simply went about their daily business without a single worry, leaving their doors unlocked and letting their children cut through the neighbors' yards without ever knocking. What the ordinary citizens of Longarone did not know was that the giant limestone mountain anchoring the left side of the deep artificial lake, a massive peak known as Monte Toc, was hiding a severe structural flaw deep beneath its green pine forests. In the old local Venetian dialect, the word toc literally translated to a piece of wood or something broken, because for generations, The traditional mountain shepherds and woodcutters had passed down stories about how the soil on that specific slope had a dangerous habit of shifting and buckling after the heavy autumn rains. But the elite engineering consultants and high-powered directors from the private electricity monopoly that owned the dam, a massive corporation known as SAID, completely brushed those ancient warnings off as unscientific folklore that couldn't possibly compete with modern calculations. The company needed to fill the basin to its absolute maximum capacity to generate electricity and complete a lucrative multi-billion lira infrastructure sale to the Italian state, so they continued to pump water into the valley, ignoring the fact that the rising liquid was soaking directly into the delicate internal layers of clay that ran through the base of the mountain. By the early fall of 1963, the physical warning signs on the slopes of Monte Toc became completely impossible for the corporate team to deny. Shepherds high up on the mountain pastures discovered that massive, jagged trenches over a meter wide were tearing straight through the green grass, and entire rows of pine trees were tilting at bizarre angles, looking like they were slowly walking down the slope as their roots pulled loose from the unstable earth. Then low, deep thuds began to vibrate through the stone foundations of the valley homes, rattling the ceramic coffee cups on the kitchen counters and causing the farm dogs to bark nervously into the dark woods at night. A courageous local journalist named Tina Merlin, who worked for a small independent newspaper, began interviewing the mountain farmers and published a series of detailed articles revealing that the base of the mountain was actively sliding. But instead of pausing the project, the powerful directors of SADE were so completely furious about the negative publicity that they actually filed a massive lawsuit against Tina Merlin, accusing her of spreading false rumors and incitement to public panic to protect their financial transaction. The state court ultimately acquitted the journalist after realizing she was simply documenting the factual changes on the mountain, but her warnings were completely pushed aside by the government authorities who were deep in corporate negotiations. Desperate to prove the dam was fully operational, before the state took total control of the grid, the company directors decided to run an unverified, dangerous experiment by rapidly draining and then refilling the reservoir to see if they could stabilize the land. They even built a tiny scaled-down physical model of the lake inside a private laboratory. But the technicians rigged the test by using smooth wooden boards to represent the mountain slope, completely omitting the slippery clay layers. So when they threw gravel into the model, it only created a minor splash. This manufactured data gave the managers the false scientific confidence they needed to keep the water levels high, even as the real mountain above the dam began moving at an uncontrollable speed of over 20 centimeters every single day. On the night of October 9, 1963, the situation inside the mountain gorge reached an absolute critical breaking point. Inside the crowded tavern down in Longarone, the air was thick with smoke, and the loud cheers of over 100 men packed tightly onto wooden benches to watch the soccer broadcast while up in the high mountain villages. Most families had already blown out their oil lamps and tucked their children into bed. But inside, the concrete control cabin built directly into the rock face at the edge of the dam, a young engineer named Gian Mario Rossi was staring at his instruments with an absolute sense of dread. The seismic needles on his graphs were spiking violently, showing that the entire flank of Monte Toc was now moving at an unprecedented catastrophic rate toward the edge of the deep water, and Rossi frantically grabbed the telephone receiver to call the company's chief director, Alberico Bayadine, who was sitting inside a comfortable private office in Venice. Rossi shouted into the phone that the mountain was breaking apart and that they needed to evacuate the valley immediately. But Bayadine, terrified of ruining the multi-billion lira estate sale during its final week, simply told the young engineer to stay calm, avoid causing a scene, and keep monitoring the dials. At exactly 10:39 p.m., the lights inside the dam control cabin flickered once, and then went completely dark as the physical reality of the corporate cover-up finally collided with the mountain. In a fraction of a second, an absolute mountain of rock earth, and entire forests measuring over 260 million cubic meters completely sheared off its limestone base and collapsed into the reservoir all at once. The giant mass hit the deep water at a staggering speed of over 68 miles per hour, creating an impact so immense that it completely filled the entire basin and displaced the body of water in less than 40 seconds. This massive displacement generated an unprecedented wave, a giant mega tsunami that rose over 250 meters into the midnight air, completely dwarfing the concrete walls of the dam itself before plunging straight down into the narrow, rocky gorge, leading directly toward the sleeping residents of Longarone. As the wave plummeted down the steep cliffs, it generated a massive air blast ahead of it, a physical shockwave so powerful that it carried the impact of a heavy explosive blast, ripping the stone roofs off the houses and creating a vacuum that literally sucked the air out of people's lungs before the liquid even touched them. Then, the absolute wall of water hit the town center with a deafening roar that sounded like a dozen freight trains crashing together at maximum speed. In less than 4 minutes, the entire community of Longarone, along with the smaller outlying villages of Parago, Rivalta, Villanova, and Fai, was completely erased from the face of the earth as the wave pulverized the brick buildings, flipped massive stone churches upside down, and dragged thousands of tons of mud and debris across the valley floor. When the sun finally rose over the mountain peaks the following morning, the rescue workers who rushed to the scene did not find a damaged town filled with broken houses. Instead, they found an absolute flat plain of gray mud, wet gravel, and giant river stones, where a vibrant community of over 2,000 people had been sleeping just hours before. The military columns and medical personnel who arrived at the edge of the valley just after dawn were completely stunned by the bizarre physical anomalies left behind by the catastrophic blast wave. They found cars wrapped tightly around the branches of high pine trees miles away from the road, and many of the bodies recovered from the thick mud had their clothing completely stripped off. A direct result of the immense sudden atmospheric pressure change that had literally torn the fabric from their bodies in a fraction of a second. The soldiers could only wander through the flat wasteland in absolute silence, carrying small wooden markers to plant in the wet gray sludge wherever they located a piece of debris or a sign of a former home. Based on declassified corporate memos, internal company telegrams, and the official investigation records from the Italian Ministry of Public Works, here is a reconstruction of what the directors were doing inside their secure offices during the final weeks leading up to the disaster. The corporate executives inside the SAID headquarters had been fully aware of the ancient paleo slide on Monte Toc since 1959, when a top geologist named Eduardo Semenza had explicitly warned them that the entire mountain was a giant sleeping landmass that would inevitably break loose if the water levels inside the reservoir were raised too high. But the directors had intentionally hidden those scientific maps from the state inspectors, and when the Earth began to accelerate its movement in September, they consciously chose to hide the warnings from the valley towns because they knew that any public evacuation order would immediately freeze the nationalization contract and ruin their massive financial payout. They calculated the risk in terms of lira and loss of capacity, deliberately choosing to run the hidden experiment of draining the lake too fast, which ironically released the exact internal water pressure that was keeping the clay friction intact, effectively triggering the catastrophic landslide with their own hands, while the families below were setting up their televisions for the evening match. The immense public outrage following the discovery of these suppressed company documents forced the Italian government to launch a full-scale criminal prosecution against the surviving executives and engineers, moving the historic trial away from the local district all the way to the city of L'Aquila to prevent a massive civil riot from disrupting the courtroom. In 1969, the High Court handed down its final judgments, finding the chief director, Alberico Biadine, guilty of multiple counts of criminal negligence causing a catastrophic landslide and mass manslaughter, sentencing him to 6 years in federal prison, though his term was later reduced to just 2 years on appeal due to his age. Another top engineering consultant named Mario Pancini, who had been completely consumed by immense psychological trauma and guilt over his role in suppressing the geologist, reports actually took his own life inside his home just days before he was scheduled to stand in front of the judge and deliver his testimony. The survivors of the Tharm House spent decades fighting the state for financial compensation, but the valley floor remained a permanent, flat plain of gray stone, ensuring that the names of over 2,000 innocent citizens would forever be anchored to the cost of corporate deception. The complete desire for industrial profit can turn a massive engineering marvel into a silent weapon that erases an entire valley in a matter of seconds, leaving behind nothing but a flat wasteland under the morning sun. And other times, a massive threat to human life drops completely out of the clear blue sky. As a screaming ball of burning fire streaks across 6 separate states before plunging into a small patch of rural woods, leaving an entire town to watch as a convoy of heavily armed soldiers seals off the perimeter in total secrecy. On a gray winter afternoon in November of 1960, a 34-year-old man named Felix Mumi walked through the elegant, brick-lined streets of Geneva, Switzerland. To the casual observer, strolling past the luxury shop windows, Felix appeared to be a wealthy diplomat or a successful international businessman, dressed in a sharp wool overcoat, carrying a heavy leather briefcase, and moving with an absolute sense of purpose. But Felix was not a typical diplomat, you know. He was a radical anti-colonial leader from Cameroon, a brilliant medical doctor who had been forced into exile because he was leading a fierce political movement to completely break his homeland free from French colonial control. And because of his highly controversial work, which involved traveling across Europe to buy weapons and secure international funding for his guerrilla fighters, Felix knew he was a marked man. He never took the same route back to his hotel twice. He constantly scanned the crowds for unfamiliar faces, and he had a strict rule never to eat any food or drink any beverage that had not been prepared right in front of his eyes. But on this particular afternoon, as he looked out at the quiet, orderly streets of Geneva surrounded by the neutral Swiss mountains, Felix allowed himself to lower his guard just a little bit, believing that the international laws of this safe European haven would keep him protected from the shadows of his political enemies. And so Felix was on his way to an upscale restaurant called L'Argent, located in one of the most affluent dining districts of the city. He had received a phone call a few days earlier from an older, distinguished-looking man who introduced himself as a prominent Canadian journalist named Paul Thompson. This journalist claimed to be deeply sympathetic to the African independence movement and promised to write a massive front-page news article that would expose the dark crimes of the colonial powers to the entire Western world. For a revolutionary leader trying to gather international support, an article of this scale was worth more than 1,000,000 francs. So despite his strict rules about meeting strangers, Felix had agreed to sit down for a private dinner to share his story, fully believing that a public restaurant filled with wealthy patrons was a perfectly safe place to conduct his consummate business. When Felix stepped inside the restaurant, the air was warm and thick, with the rich smells of melted butter, roasted meats, and expensive tobacco. The dining room was filled with the soft murmurs of wealthy elites, the constant clinking of silver cutlery against fine porcelain, and waiters in black tuxedos moving smoothly between tables covered in crisp white linen. Sitting at a secluded table in the far corner of the room was the older Canadian journalist. He had silver hair, wore elegant gold-rimmed glasses, and possessed a warm smile that made Felix feel comfortable the moment he walked over and shook his hand. The man opened a thick, leather-bound notebook, pulled out an expensive gold fountain pen, and began asking incredibly detailed, intelligent questions about Cameroon's future, taking careful notes as Felix spoke with his usual burning passion. A waiter approached the table to take their drink orders, and Felix, feeling a bit celebratory about the progress of the interview, ordered a classic glass of Pernod, a traditional French anise-flavored liqueur that turns a distinct cloudy, milky green color when cold water is added to it. The older journalist ordered a glass of white wine and continued the conversation smoothly, nodding along with absolute admiration as Felix explained his plans for securing weapons and running the logistics of his political movement. The food arrived, and the two men ate and talked for over an hour, with the older man playing the role of a fascinated reporter to absolute perfection, never once breaking character or showing a single sign of nervousness as he guided the conversation deeper into Felix's secret networks. Now, as the dinner was winding down and the table was being cleared, the waiter brought over a small porcelain plate with the bill, and the older journalist reached into his jacket pocket to pull out his leather wallet. But as he did, the man suddenly let out a small gasp, looking down at the carpet beneath the table. He looked up at Felix with an embarrassed expression and said that his expensive gold fountain pen must have slipped out of his fingers and rolled into the dark space, deep beneath the heavy linen tablecloth. Felix, being a naturally polite and helpful person, instinctively leaned forward in his chair, ducked his head completely beneath the edge of the table, and began searching through the shadows on the carpet, trying his best to locate the missing pen for his companion. The search took no more than 5 or 6 seconds of fumbling around in the dark before Felix sat back up, shaking his head and apologizing for not being able to find it. The journalist smiled warmly, pulled another pen from his vest pocket, and said it was no big deal at all, thanking Felix for his kindness. Felix reached across the white linen, grabbed his glass of Pernod, and swallowed the final remaining ounces of the milky green liquid. He didn't notice any strange texture, and he did not detect any unusual chemical taste because the drink's natural, incredibly intense, sharp licorice flavor completely dominated his palate and masked everything else. The two men stood up, shook hands warmly, and promised to stay in touch as the journalist packed up his notebook and left the establishment. Felix walked out of the restaurant feeling incredibly optimistic about the upcoming news article and made the short walk back to his room at the Hotel Grand Prix, completely unaware that his body had just absorbed a massive lethal dose of an odorless, tasteless heavy metal called thallium. Hours passed and the sun set completely over the city, casting the hotel room into deep shadow. Felix was lying on his bed reading through some political documents under the soft glow of a bedside lamp when a sudden sharp pressure flared up in the exact center of his abdomen. He sat up, gasping for breath, as the pressure turned into a blinding, white-hot pain that felt like someone was twisting a rusted iron knife inside his stomach. He stumbled across the carpet toward the bathroom, his limbs suddenly feeling incredibly heavy and unresponsive, and began vomiting violently into the porcelain sink. He collapsed onto the cold tile floor, his skin covered in a thick, icy sweat, believing that he was simply suffering from a severe case of food poisoning from something he had eaten at the restaurant earlier that afternoon. But by the following morning, the physical destruction of his body had accelerated at a massive, unnatural rate. Felix dragged his weak body back to his feet and looked into the bathroom mirror, and what he saw made him freeze in place. His face was completely pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and when he raised his right hand to wipe the cold sweat from his forehead, his fingers came away covered in thick clumps of black hair. He looked down at the white tile floor and realized that his hair was falling out in massive bloody patches, leaving his scalp completely bare in places. Now, because Felix was a fully trained medical doctor who had studied forensic toxicology, the pieces of the puzzle instantly clicked together in his mind. He knew that sudden massive hair loss combined with catastrophic internal bleeding was the classic, undeniable clinical signature of heavy metal poisoning. He realized with absolute clarity that this was not an illness, and it was not food poisoning. He had been targeted by a professional assassin, and his time was running out. Felix used the last remaining ounces of his physical strength to reach the telephone on the nightstand, dialed the front desk, and managed to gasp out a desperate plea for medical help before collapsing heavily onto the carpet. An ambulance arrived within minutes, and the hotel staff found him completely unconscious. His body locked in rigid muscle spasms as his central nervous system began to shut down entirely. He was rushed to the emergency ward of the Geneva University Hospital, where a team of toxicologists and medical specialists immediately hooked him up to life support monitors, completely baffled by the speed at which his internal organs were failing. Word of the high-profile political emergency quickly reached the Geneva Police Department, and a veteran detective named Inspector Robert Dubois was dispatched to the hospital room to investigate what looked like a highly suspicious incident. When Dubois stepped inside the room, the scene was grim, you know. The medical monitors were beeping frantically, and the doctors explained that Felix's blood chemistry was completely toxic, showing massive levels of a heavy foreign element that was systematically destroying his nervous system. The police initially began looking into internal rivalries within Felix's own political party, the Union of the Peoples of Cameroon, which had been fracturing into bitter internal conflicts and power struggles over the control of the movement. Dubois sent out teams of officers to interview Felix's regular associates and check the hotel logs for any guest who might have slipped into his room during the night. But just as the detectives were preparing to launch a wide-scale audit of the local political factions, Felix Mumi suddenly opened his eyes. Despite the immense physical trauma and the fact that his internal organs were actively failing, his mind remained completely clear and lucid for a few short minutes. He looked directly at Inspector Dubois, his voice a raspy whisper through his cracked lips, and he pointed his weak finger toward the door. He told the detective that the theories about his political rivals were a complete waste of time. He stated clearly that he had been poisoned during his dinner at the restaurant the previous afternoon, and he named the older Canadian journalist Paul Thompson as the person who had orchestrated the attack. Felix explained exactly how the man had dropped his fountain pen and used the distraction to access his drink, providing a precise description of the silver-haired man before slipping into a deep coma from which he would never wake. Up, Inspector Dubois leapt into action. Dispatching a team of officers back to the high-end restaurant to secure the table, seize the remaining glassware, and interview the staff. The waiter who had served the two men confirmed the entire interaction, stating that the older man had paid the bill in cash and had left the premises immediately after Felix drank the last of his Pernod. But when the detectives checked the city's hotel registries, train stations, and border checkpoints for a Canadian journalist named Paul Thompson, they found absolutely nothing. The name was completely fake, a ghost identity used to slip through the country without leaving a paper trail. The Swiss authorities launched a massive coordinated manhunt across the city, checking transport hubs and airports, But the older man had already vanished across the border into France, leaving the detective with a room full of toxic medical reports and a dying political leader. Based on declassified intelligence documents from the French Secret Service and the criminal investigation files of the Swiss Federal Archives, here is a reconstruction of what actually happened to Felix Roland Mumey on the morning of November 3rd, 1960. The older man sitting across the table at the restaurant was not a Canadian journalist named Paul Thompson, and he had no interest in writing an article about African independence. His real name was William Bechtel, a 57-year-old veteran operative and contract assassin for the SDECE, the French Secret Service. Bechtel had been sent to Geneva on a state-sanctioned execution mission ordered by top-level intelligence directors in Paris, who viewed Felix's weapon-buying trips as a direct, unacceptable threat to French colonial interests in West Africa. Bechtel had spent weeks tracking Felix's movements across Europe, studying his security habits and realizing that the leader was incredibly careful about what he consumed. He knew he could never get close enough to use a traditional weapon, so he decided to use a highly concentrated liquid dose of thallium, a chemical compound so toxic and unnoticeable that it was known in the intelligence world as the poisoner's poison. Bechtel bought a premium leather journal, faked the journalist identity, and used the promise of a news article to lure Felix into the public restaurant, knowing that the busy environment would make the leader drop his guard. When the bill arrived at the end of the meal, Bechtel purposely dropped his expensive gold fountain pen onto the carpet beneath the long white linen tablecloth, knowing that Felix's polite nature would force him to lean down and search for it. The moment Felix's head disappeared beneath the edge of the table, Bechtel smoothly reached into his vest pocket, pulled out a small glass vial, and emptied the liquid thallium directly into the remaining milky green Pernod in Felix's glass. The chemical dissolved instantly into the alcohol without changing its color, consistency, or smell. Bechtel calmly tucked the empty vial back into his pocket, smiled as Felix sat back up, and watched with absolute satisfaction as the leader swallowed the lethal trap before walking out of the restaurant to catch a waiting train back to Paris. On November 3rd, 1960, after spending days locked on life support machines, 34-year-old Felix Roland Mumey suffered complete cardiovascular collapse and died inside his hospital bed. The Swiss authorities officially ruled his death a homicide by thallium poisoning and issued an international arrest warrant for William Bechtel, but the French government completely refused to cooperate with the investigation, keeping Bechtel hidden inside their military intelligence network and burying the declassified files deep inside the state archives to protect the Secret Service from international exposure. William Bechtel successfully eluded justice for over 3 decades, living a quiet, comfortable life in France under the protection of his handlers. It wasn't until 1992, 32 years after the murder, that he was accidentally tracked down and arrested during a trip to Germany. He was extradited to Switzerland to finally face trial for the assassination. But by that point, Bechtel was an 85-year-old man, and the French government exerted massive, overwhelming diplomatic and political pressure on the Swiss courts, claiming that the statute of limitations had passed and that the trial would destroy international relations. The Swiss judges ultimately caved to the pressure, dropping all criminal charges and allowing Bechtel to walk out of the courtroom a free man. He returned to France and died of natural causes inside his own home, meaning the state-sanctioned execution of Felix Mumey officially went completely unpunished. A deep-cover intelligence operative can use a fabricated identity and a single moment of distraction to eliminate a high-profile political target and disappear into the safety of a protecting state without ever leaving a trace behind. But while some secrets are buried deep inside the dusty vaults of a European government archive, others drop completely out of the clear blue sky. As a screaming ball of blinding white fire streaks across 6 separate states, before plunging into a small patch of rural woods, leaving an entire town to watch as a convoy of heavily armed soldiers seals off the perimeter in absolute, unbroken silence. On the evening of August 14, 1962, a 34-year-old postal worker named Patrick Shana was sitting behind the wheel of a heavy gray Dodge mail truck, navigating the long, winding stretches of Route 3 in eastern Massachusetts. The sun had already dipped completely below the tree line, leaving the asphalt ahead lit only by the pale amber glow of the vehicle's headlights. Sitting right next to him in the passenger seat was his coworker Thomas Richards, an armed guard who sat with his hands resting casually on a standard-issue, snub-nosed revolver tucked into his canvas belt. The two men were driving their regular, routine route from the historic coastal towns of Cape Cod back toward the main sorting facilities in the city of Boston, and they were both looking forward to finishing up their long shift so they could head home to their families. They had been operating this specific high-security transport for a couple of years, and the work had always been completely uneventful, consisting mostly of hauling heavy canvas sacks of registered mail and paperwork between separate municipal bank branches. But on this particular summer evening, the cargo sitting in the padlocked steel bay directly behind their seats was vastly different from their usual shipments of business letters and bank statements. Tucked inside the heavy canvas, sacks were stacks of cash, $1.5 million in completely unmarked, low-denomination banknotes that were being transferred directly to the Federal Reserve Bank in Boston. Patrick and Thomas had personally verified the heavy padlocks on the rear gate before leaving the final terminal, ensuring the steel bars were completely locked, and they had been instructed to maintain a steady speed and avoid making any unscheduled stops along the highway. They were sipping lukewarm black coffee from a tin thermos to stay awake against the monotonous drone of the truck's engine, listening to the crickets buzzing loudly in the tall grass along the edge of the dark woods that lined either side of the empty road. Now, around 8:30 in the evening, as the truck rolled through a particularly secluded stretch of the highway near the town of Plymouth, Patrick suddenly stepped on the brake pedal, causing the heavy vehicle to slide slightly on the brake pedal. Dark asphalt. Just a few yards ahead, sitting right in the middle of their lane, was a bright orange highway detour sign mounted on a wooden frame, completely blocking any forward path. Standing right next to the barrier was a man dressed in a crisp blue police uniform wearing a white officer's hat and waving a large red-lensed flashlight in slow, smooth circles to direct traffic toward a narrow, unpaved logging trail that cut deep into the surrounding pine forest. Patrick slowed the mail truck down to an absolute crawl, rolling his driver's side window down to ask the officer what kind of accident had occurred on the main road ahead. But the moment the gray truck came to a complete stop, the man in the police uniform dropped the red flashlight onto the dirt, reached beneath a canvas tarp draped over the wooden detour sign, and pulled out a heavy 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. He aimed the iron barrel straight at Patrick's face through the open window, his expression completely blank beneath the brim of his hat. Before Thomas could even reach down to unholster his snub-nosed revolver, two more men wearing dark cloth masks and heavy winter coats leapt out from the tall weeds at the edge of the highway ditch, armed with military-style submachine guns. They tore the passenger side door open, grabbing Thomas by his shirt, while the man in the uniform barked aloud, aggressive order for both workers to step out of the cab immediately, keep their hands flat on their heads, and avoid looking at their faces under any circumstances. So Patrick and Thomas complied perfectly, stepping down onto the gravel with their hands up, their hearts pounding wildly against their ribs, as the armed men quickly shoved them toward the rear gate of the mail truck. The thieves pulled a heavy pair of industrial bolt cutters from their vehicle, walked up to the padlocked gate, and snapped the massive steel bars with a single sharp metallic crack. They threw the heavy steel doors wide open, ordered the two postal workers to crawl inside the dark cargo hold, and immediately bound their wrists and ankles tightly with multiple loops of thick hemp rope before wrapping heavy cloth blindfolds over their eyes. Patrick and Thomas lay face down on the hard metal floorboards, listening to the sounds of the men systematically dragging the heavy canvas mail sacks across the floor and tossing them into the backs of accomplice cars parked in the shadows of the trees. The thieves slammed the rear doors shut and turned the heavy latch, plunging the two workers into absolute pitch-black darkness inside the hot steel hold of the truck. Patrick and Thomas lay completely still, listening to the distant roar of car engines accelerating away down the highway until the forest went completely silent again. They spent hours trapped on the floor, their muscles cramping from the tight ropes, listening to the wind rustling the pine needles outside, wondering if the men were going to return to set the vehicle on fire to destroy the evidence. They had absolutely no way of tracking the passage of time in the dark. And it wasn't until late the following morning that a passing highway maintenance worker noticed the gray postal vehicle parked at a bizarre angle on the overgrown logging trail and called the local sheriff's department to report a suspicious vehicle. When the local deputies and federal agents arrived at the logging trail, they cut the latch open and pulled Patrick and Thomas out of the hold, finding them dehydrated and deeply shaken up but completely unharmed. The discovery immediately triggered a massive, unprecedented response from the federal government, with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the United States Postal Inspection Service flooding the entire county of Plymouth with dozens of specialized investigators. They set up search perimeters around the highway detour site, sifting through the dirt and vacuuming the grass for any sign of a dropped match, a cigarette butt, or a distinctive tire impression. But the hot summer dust had completely obscured any clear tracks. The investigators knew they were dealing with an incredibly sophisticated crew because pulling off a bloodless clean ambush on a federal money shipment required an immense amount of precise scheduling information and inside knowledge. So, the postal inspectors initially focused the entire weight of their investigation on the possibility of internal collusion within the post office department. They suspected that someone inside the sorting facility must have leaked the exact route, the departure time, and the cash volume of the Cape Cod truck to an outside criminal network. Federal agents spent several months tailing Patrick and Thomas, auditing their personal savings accounts, interviewing their neighbors, and pulling decades of phone records to see if they had any unexplained contact with known gamblers or local bookmakers. They even subjected both drivers to multiple rounds of intense, isolated polygraph examinations to see if their cover stories would crack under pressure. But the background checks came back completely flawless, and the lie detector test confirmed that both men were simply ordinary low-wage government employees who had been genuinely occupied by the shotguns and had absolutely no connection to the thieves. Now, as the internal lead began to fall apart completely, the FBI shifted its focus toward the powerful organized crime syndicates operating out of Boston and Rhode Island, specifically looking into the leadership of the Patriarca crime family. Federal agents placed wiretaps on known mob hangouts in South Boston, squeezed confidential informants inside the illegal gambling dens, and tracked local gangsters who suddenly began displaying signs of unexplained wealth. Investigators spent weeks tailing a specific local criminal who had suddenly purchased a brand new luxury fishing boat with cash just days after the robbery took place. But after months of intense surveillance and round-the-clock interviews, the informants insisted that the mafia had nothing to do with the score, and the boat purchase was eventually traced back to an entirely separate, verified family inheritance, leaving the detectives with a stack of empty folders and a complete wall of silence. Years passed, and the investigation slowly began to turn into a frozen cold case, with the public openly mocking the federal government for being completely outsmarted by a crew of highway thieves who had managed to steal an absolute fortune, without ever firing a single shot. But in 1967, 5 long years after the cash had vanished, a major break appeared to happen when a petty criminal sitting inside a federal prison cell offered a confidential tip to investigators in exchange for a massive reduction in his own sentence. He named a tight crew of local suspects from the Boston area, claiming he had personally sat next to them in a local bar while they bragged about setting up the Plymouth Detour and dividing the $1.5 million. The postal inspectors rushed the information to a federal grand jury, securing official indictments against 3 men, and the newspapers proudly announced that the perfect crime had finally been solved. But when the high-profile federal trial finally began, the prosecution's case completely collapsed on the witness stand in a matter of days. Under intense cross-examination from the defense attorneys, the jailhouse informant became deeply confused, contradicted his own timeline, and ultimately admitted that he had completely fabricated the entire story, having read the specific details of the heist in old newspaper clippings in the prison library just to trick the government into granting him an early release. With absolutely no physical evidence, no fingerprints on the truck, and not a single dollar of the cash ever located, the federal judge had no choice but to order an immediate acquittal for all 3 suspects, walking them out of the courtroom while the investigators were forced to return to their desks with absolutely nothing to show for years of work. Based on the declassified files from the United States Postal Inspection Service and the physical evidence left behind at the abandoned logging trail, here is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened on that summer evening in Day, 1962. The crew of criminals had spent months planning the operation, tracking the mail truck schedule from the bushes, and learning exactly which days held the highest volume of cash transfers from the Cape Cod banks. They gathered inside an abandoned barn a few miles outside of Plymouth, checking the mechanisms on their submachine guns and shotguns, while one of the men slipped into a blue police uniform that had been stolen from a local laundry delivery van weeks prior. They had also stolen a set of official orange highway detour signs from a local road construction site, packing them into the back of a stolen sedan before driving out to the secluded stretch of Route 3 under the cover of darkness. They placed the wooden detour barriers right in the center of the dark asphalt lane, turning on their flashlights and waiting in the tall weeds at the edge of the ditch until they saw the distinct headlights of the gray Dodge mail truck approaching the curve. The leader stepped smoothly onto the road, waving his red-lensed flashlight in slow circles, playing the role of a legitimate traffic officer to absolute perfection, so the unsuspecting drivers would bring the heavy vehicle to a complete stop right in front of the ambush point. The execution was completely silent, rapid, and bloodless because they knew exactly how many minutes they had before the next scheduled commercial truck would pass through that section of the highway. They cut the locks, transferred the heavy canvas sacks into their own vehicles in less than 5 minutes, and then drove to a secondary safe house where they systematically divided the unmarked currency before melting their weapons down in an industrial furnace and scattering the cash across separate bank accounts across the continent. The statute of limitations on the Great Plymouth Mail robbery eventually expired entirely, meaning that even if the true masterminds walked into a police station tomorrow and confessed to the heist, they could never be legally charged or prosecuted for the crime under American law. Not a single dollar of the $1.5 million was ever recovered by federal agents. And the true identities of the men who stood behind the wooden detour sign remain an absolute mystery to this day. The brilliant, bloodless highway ambush remains the most successful, flawless, unsolved mail heist in the history of the United States, a perfect execution of criminal planning that completely baffled the smartest investigators in the world. The orange detour signs were packed back into the dark vehicles and driven away into the night, leaving the empty stretch of asphalt completely silent under the summer stars as the heavy tire tracks faded into the roadside dust. Much like the dark shadow of an enormous, curved concrete wall can loom silently over a deep alpine thunglung, holding back millions of tons of deep water while the unsuspecting residents of the town below turn off their lamps and drift off to sleep. On a freezing November afternoon in 1963, a certified financial inspector gripped the cold metal railings of a towering steel storage tank in Bayonne, New Jersey. The wind from the harbor bit into his cheeks as he slowly made his way up the slippery spiral staircase, his heavy rubber boots clanking loudly against the iron steps. At the top, he pulled open a heavy steel hatch, peered into the dark, echoing vat, and lowered a long, weighted steel tape down into the liquid. When he reeled it back up, the tape was covered in a thick, golden layer of vegetable oil, confirming the tank was kind of completely full to the top. He smiled, checked a box on his official clipboard, and signed a document authorizing a multi-million-dollar loan. Completely unaware that directly beneath that thin 2-foot layer of oil sat millions of gallons of ordinary salt water pumped straight out of the New York harbor. Now, before we find out how a single working-class guy managed to use basic middle school science to completely fool the smartest minds on Wall Street and pull off one of the biggest financial deceptions in American history, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do. And we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every single week. So if that's of interest to you, please rent a huge billboard on the side of the highway and just put a bunch of deeply embarrassing photos of the like button on it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get back into today's story. To understand how this massive operation came to life, we need to look closely at a 37-year-old man named Anthony DeAngelis, though everyone on the docks simply knew him as Tino. Tino was a short, heavy-set guy who grew up in a working-class neighborhood, but he possessed an absolute burning ambition to make a name for himself in the corporate world. He started his career in the meatpacking industry, where he quickly gained a reputation for being incredibly sharp when it came to tracking supply chains and cutting down operational costs. In the late 1950s, Tino noticed that the United States government was launching a massive international aid initiative called the Food for Peace program. This initiative required the government to purchase astronomical amounts of domestic vegetable and salad oil to ship to developing nations across the globe, creating a massive, highly lucrative market for anyone who could supply the fluid. So Tino realized this was his golden opportunity to build an absolute empire, and he quickly established the Allied Crude Vegetable Oil Refining Corporation. He leased a massive sprawling industrial tank farm right along the waterfront in Bayonne, New Jersey, turning it into a non-stop hub of activity. The yard was a chaotic, loud maze of towering steel cylinders, network pipes, and constant steam vents that hissed into the cold air, filling the area with the heavy smell of industrial grease and salty sea air. Day and night, massive diesel trucks rumbled through the gates, and large cargo ships docked at the piers to pump vegetable oil into the vats. Tino walked the muddy yard every single day wearing cheap grease-stained work clothes and chatting casually with the laborers, showing an approachable charm that made him incredibly well-liked by everyone. He didn't look like a high-flying corporate executive, and that exact, unthreatening, ordinary appearance was his greatest asset. Because when Wall Street bankers looked at him, they saw an honest, hardworking businessman who was simply trying to run a successful regional refinery. But Tino had a massive problem, because he didn't just want to run a regular refinery, he wanted to completely corner the global soybean oil futures market. This was a high-stakes financial play that required an absolute mountain of ready cash that his small corporation simply did not possess. So, he approached some of the most sophisticated financial institutions on Wall Street, including a specialized warehousing subsidiary owned by American Express. Tino offered them a seemingly perfect arrangement, where he would use his vast, rapidly growing inventory of salad oil stored in the Bayonne tanks as physical collateral to secure massive short-term loans. His company issued official warehouse receipts for the oil, which functioned exactly like cash on the trading floors, allowing him to borrow money from major banks like Chase Manhattan and Bank of America. Some junior financial analysts at the banks were initially skeptical, pointing out that his company was expanding too quickly, but the senior directors completely brushed those concerns aside, eager to get a piece of the massive interest payments Tino was offering. Now, because the bankers were professional lenders, they still insisted on establishing a strict, rigorous inspection routine to verify that the salad oil physically existed inside the vats before wiring any new funds. Every single week, bank inspectors arrived at the Allied Crude Refinery carrying official clipboards, blueprints, and weighted dipsticks to check the vast inventory. They would follow a designated route through the steel maze, climbing the rusty ladders of random tanks to measure the depth of the fluid. The inspectors would unlatch the top hatches, smell the rich, distinct aroma of vegetable oil, and watch as their weighted measuring tapes dropped 40 or 50 feet down to the bottom of the vats. Every single test came back completely perfect, showing that Tino's inventory was expanding at an unbelievable rate. And based on those official reports, the banks continuously cleared his credit lines, wiring over $150 million straight into Tino's corporate accounts, completely convinced their investment was fully secured by millions of gallons of valuable commodity. But by late 1963, Tino's financial empire began to produce some very strange, impossible anomalies that rival traders on the market simply could not ignore. Financial analysts who looked closely at the shipping logs and logistics paperwork realized that the volume of salad oil Tino officially claimed to hold inside his New Jersey tank farm was literally greater than the recorded inventory of the entire United States. On paper, his small refinery possessed more vegetable oil than the entire agricultural output of the country, and there weren't even enough cargo ships in the entire Atlantic Ocean to transport the amount of fluid he claimed to be refining. On top of that, Tino didn't spend this money on personal luxury items like mansions or yachts. He was funneling every single dollar directly back into buying more futures contracts to inflate his position, creating a vicious cycle where he had to build more fake inventory to secure more loans just to pay the interest on the old ones. So rival brokers began whispering on the trading floors, suggesting that something was completely distorted inside the Allied Crude corporate ledger. And the rumors eventually caught the attention of federal regulators at the Securities and Exchange Commission. The government quietly dispatched a new, independent team of investigators and engineering experts to the Bayonne yard to conduct an unannounced, exhaustive audit of the steel vats. When the federal agents marched into the refinery gates with their own specialized equipment, Tino's regular staff began to show signs of intense nervousness, trying their best to delay the audit by claiming several main tank valves were completely rusted shut. But the investigators refused to leave, demanding full access to the inspection hatches, and as they began dropping deep-core sampling pumps into the center of the giant cylinders, the true nature of the operation came to light. Based on the official investigation records from the United States Securities and Exchange Commission and federal district court indictments from 1964, here is a reconstruction of what Tino DeAngelis and his inner circle of mechanics were actually doing inside that industrial yard. The mechanics had spent months modifying the internal plumbing of the giant steel vats, using basic middle school physics to create an absolute illusion of wealth. They knew that vegetable oil has a lower density than water, meaning that if you pour them into the same container, the oil will always float directly on top of the water without mixing. So, they connected heavy-duty industrial hoses to the harbor water lines and filled the giant tanks 95% of the way up, with ordinary salt water pumped straight out of the New York harbor. Then they carefully poured a thin layer of actual vegetable oil just a few feet deep, right onto the surface of the water, creating a perfect golden sheen that completely covered the entire top area of the vat so that anyone who opened the hatch would only see and smell high-grade salad oil. And to ensure that the weighted dipsticks used by the weekly bank inspectors would never expose the water below, Tino's mechanics installed long vertical steel tubes directly beneath the designated inspection hatches. They filled these specific tubes with solid lard or heavy grease so that no matter how deep the inspector dropped his tape, it would only pass through the grease tube and always come back up covered in high-quality oil. Furthermore, the crew installed an intricate network of underground bypass pipes and secret pumps between the separate vats, allowing a small team to rapidly pump the exact same small batch of actual vegetable oil from tank to tank in the middle of the night, always staying one step ahead of the inspector's walking schedule, so the same oil was counted dozens of times across the yard. The entire multi-million-dollar illusion came to an abrupt, violent halt when the federal investigators used special core sampling cups that pulled liquid from the bottom of the vats, revealing nothing but brackish river water and sludge. The news of the massive fraud broke on November 19, 1963, triggering an absolute catastrophic panic across the entire financial sector. Tino's corporation instantly collapsed into bankruptcy, and because his salad oil contracts had been used as collateral across the market, dozens of prominent brokerage firms realized their assets were completely worthless, causing them to shut down their operations in a single afternoon. The stock market suffered a massive sell-off, with brokers screaming on the floor as the ticker tape fell behind by hours, losing billions of dollars in value within a matter of hours. And the governor of the New York Stock Exchange had to take the unprecedented step of temporarily suspending trading to prevent a total collapse of the financial grid, while the Federal Reserve held emergency meetings to stabilize the economy. Now, the impact on American Express was absolute, because their specialized warehousing subsidiary was forced into immediate liquidation, and the parent company's stock lost over 50% of its value in a matter of days, nearly driving one of the oldest, most respected financial institutions in the world into permanent bankruptcy. Senior board members from Manhattan flew into the Bayonne yard in a state of complete disbelief, standing in the mud as federal agents opened the main valves, watching millions of gallons of ordinary harbor water spill across the yard. Instead of the valuable salad oil they thought they owned, federal marshals descended on Tino's private estate, placing him under immediate arrest and seizing every single asset, corporate ledger, and bank record associated with the Allied Crude Corporation. In 1965, Anthony DeAngelis stood inside a packed federal courtroom in New Jersey, facing a mountain of evidence detailing how he had completely fooled the smartest minds on Wall Street, using nothing but harbor water, false pipes. During the trial, his high-priced defense lawyers tried to argue that the missing oil was the result of bad bookkeeping and operational accidents rather than an intentional fraud. But the federal prosecutors completely dismantled that story by presenting the physical blueprints of the modified tanks and secret valves. He was found guilty on multiple counts of conspiracy wire fraud and falsifying financial documents, and the judge handed down a strict sentence of 7 years in a federal prison. Tino served his full term, was eventually released, and lived a quiet life until his death, leaving behind a legacy of a ridiculously simple con that completely forced the global financial community to overhaul their rules for verifying warehouse commodities. When you sit back and look at the wreckage left behind by Anthony Tino DeAngelis, the thing that stays with you isn't the sight of a traditional crime scene, There are no chalk outlines on the pavement, and there is no physical harm to make your stomach turn. But what makes this entire event so deeply unsettling is how it exposes the absolute illusion of stability we surround ourselves with every single day. We walk through a world built on massive systems, thinking they are solid, but this story shows how thin that surface layer really is. It is profoundly disturbing because it forces you to realize that some of the biggest, most powerful institutions in our society are built on nothing more than a shared willingness to believe a good story. Now, when those bank inspectors stood on top of those massive steel tanks in Bayonne, New Jersey, they thought they were looking at the literal foundations of global trade. They smelled the rich oil. They saw the golden liquid reflecting the sun, and they felt an absolute sense of security. But beneath that tiny 2-foot layer of oil lay millions of gallons of ordinary salt water pumped right out of the harbor, And that image of a thin layer of substance floating over a massive void of useless water is the perfect metaphor for the dark side of our daily lives, you know. It makes you wonder how many things in your own life are designed exactly like those tanks. So you look at the institutions you trust, the businesses you rely on, and even the people you encounter. And you start to ask yourself if you are truly looking at something solid or if you are just being fooled by a clever surface designed to keep you from asking uncomfortable questions. The real distress here doesn't come from a hidden monster or a physical threat, but from the realization of how easily our collective trust can be weaponized against us. We are conditioned from a very young age to look at fancy office buildings, official clipboards, and long financial ledger books as proof of absolute truth. But this story proves that those symbols of authority are incredibly easy to fake if a person has enough audacity and a basic understanding of human psychology, you know. Tino didn't need a high-tech laboratory or an elite network of international hackers to bring the American financial system to its knees in 1963. He didn't even need to break a single lock, so to speak. All he needed was a basic middle school science concept and the deep unspoken knowledge that when people are making a massive amount of money, they completely stop looking beneath the surface. And that exact systemic blindness is what makes this swindle so incredibly uncomfortable to contemplate. Now, when you examine the human element of this case, it reveals something deeply uncomfortable about our shared human nature. We like to think of ourselves as rational, critical thinkers who evaluate evidence and make careful decisions based on hard data. But the reality is that we are incredibly vulnerable to our own desires. And when a con man shows up, offering us exactly what we want to see, we will actively help him build the lie just to keep the fantasy alive. The elite bankers on Wall Street and the high-level executives at American Express weren't stupid people by any stretch of the imagination, you know. They were some of the most highly educated, experienced financial minds in the world. But they allowed themselves to be fooled out of over $150 million because their own greed had created a massive blind spot in their vision. They didn't see the fake pipes or the false bottoms because looking too closely would mean stopping the flow of massive profits. And so this case exposes a profound truth about how our modern society operates, especially when it comes to the pursuit of wealth and status. It shows how we have built a culture that prioritizes the appearance of substance over the reality of substance. Tino's entire business was a hollow shell, but because it looked magnificent from the outside, it was granted an absolute stamp of legitimacy by the highest institutions in the land. The system didn't catch the fraud because the system was designed to reward the illusion of growth. But what does this say about our collective responsibility to one another, you know? When a shared system like the stock market or a major financial institution crumbles because of a deception like this, the damage doesn't just stay confined to the wealthy investors at the top of the pyramid. So, when the market crashed temporarily in late 1963, ordinary citizens who had absolutely no connection to Tino or his fake salad oil tanks felt the economic shockwaves, losing their savings and their security. It reveals a deep moral failure at the heart of our modern economic structure, where the people tasked with protecting the shared public trust are easily blinded by the promise of personal gain. The bank inspectors who climbed those stairs every week weren't just failing to do their jobs, they were actively violating their responsibility to ensure the safety of the entire system. They accepted the surface layer because it was easy, and that refusal to look deeper is a betrayal of the ethics that keep a society together. Now, the ultimate lesson you should take away from this story after listening to the final details isn't a cynical lesson about never trusting anyone again, you know? It's not about retreating into absolute isolation or assuming that everything around you is a complete lie. Instead, it is a powerful, urgent reminder that true value and real integrity can never be faked by surface appearances, and that we have a personal duty to look beneath the golden oil floating on top. We must find the personal courage to ask the difficult, uncomfortable questions, even when everyone around us is content to just accept the illusion. If a system or a relationship or a project seems too perfect to be true, it usually means there is a massive layer of salt water hiding directly beneath the surface, waiting to drag the entire structure down into the mud. Critical thinking and ethical responsibility are the only real defenses we have against the con men of the world. And so when you think about Tino DeAngelis sitting inside his federal prison cell after his arrest in 1964, you realize that he wasn't an outsider who forced his way into our society to destroy it. He was kind of a direct product of the culture we built, a man who saw that we value the packaging way more than the actual contents. He simply showed us a mirror of our own collective greed, and the reflection we saw was shockingly hollow. True safety in our daily lives doesn't come from the height of our brick walls or the complexity of our financial ledger books, but from our willingness to remain vigilant and prioritize substance over style. We have to take responsibility for what we allow ourselves to believe, because the moment we trade our critical thinking for the promise of an easy fortune, we become the active accomplices in our own undoing. And that is a truth we can never afford to forget. When you look at the architecture of a scam like this, you realize it is kind of like a disease that preys on the natural tendency of the human mind to seek out comfort and validation. We are all deeply susceptible to confirmation bias, which means that once we decide to believe in a specific outcome, we will intentionally ignore any piece of evidence that contradicts our desire. The bankers wanted to believe Tino was an agricultural genius because that belief made them feel incredibly smart and successful. And so they built a massive protective wall around the lie, shielding it from their own junior analysts who were trying to raise the alarm. Now this reveals a dark truth about how authority works in our society, you know? The higher a person climbs up the institutional ladder, the more insulated they become from the gritty reality on the ground. The senior directors at American Express were sitting in beautiful, wood-paneled offices in Manhattan, miles away from the grease and salt water of the Bayonne docks. They relied on a simple piece of paper with an official signature to verify their investments completely, forgetting that a signature can be forged and a ledger book can be faked by anyone with a pen. This separation between corporate authority and physical reality is where the con man thrives, so to speak. He sets up his illusion in the messy, overlooked corners of the world, knowing that the people at the top will never bother to get their expensive shoes dirty checking his work. But the profoundly disturbing nature of the swindle also comes from the realization of how fragile our entire global economic grid really is, you know? We tend to view the stock market and global banks as these massive, unshakable structures that are governed by complex mathematical equations and flawless security protocols. But this story shows that the entire system is actually incredibly delicate, held together by nothing more than a fragile spiderweb of mutual trust. When Tino's tanks were finally exposed as hollow shells filled with river water, the shockwaves almost broke the back of the entire financial market in 1963. It didn't just hurt Tino's company, it caused a massive systemic freeze that nearly bankrupted one of the oldest credit card corporations in the world. And that level of vulnerability is shocking to contemplate because it means that our entire way of life can be disrupted by a single man with a clever idea. It highlights a fundamental flaw in the way we evaluate success and status in modern society, you know. We are a culture that is completely obsessed with raw numbers, growth percentages, and upward trends on a graph. By showcasing a continuous stream of false metrics, a single individual can paralyze the analytical minds of entire banking boards. The system rewarded his deception because his deception looked like prosperity, and in our world, prosperity is rarely questioned until it is far too late. Now, this forces us to confront a tough ethical question about our personal responsibility when we see something that doesn't feel right. There were undoubtedly laborers, truck drivers, and low-level mechanics working in that Bayonne yard who knew exactly what was flowing through those pipes. They saw the salt water being sucked out of the harbor, and they knew that the vats were completely hollow, but they chose to remain silent because they needed to protect their weekly paychecks. And you can't necessarily blame them for wanting to take care of their families, you know. It is kind of a harsh reality of everyday life that the people at the bottom of the economic ladder are often forced to comply with the corruption of the people at the top just to survive. But that collective compliance is exactly what allows a massive scam to grow until it is too huge to control, dragging everyone down into the collapse when the bubble finally bursts. So what is the antidote to this kind of systemic blindness and moral decay? The message we must take away from the wreckage of 1963 is that we have a personal, unshakable obligation to maintain our critical faculties at all times. We cannot outsource our thinking to an institution, a clipboard, or a government stamp. We have to be willing to look past the beautiful packaging and demand to see the actual contents of the tank. True vigilance requires us to accept the discomfort of asking difficult questions, even when everyone else in the room wants to just sit back and enjoy the show. It means being the person who insists on dropping the core sampling cup all the way to the very bottom of the vat, past the thin layer of golden oil just to verify what is really hiding in the dark. It is an exhausting way to live, but it is the only real protection we have against the illusions of the world. Because the truth is, the con men of our history don't always look like shady criminals hiding in dark alleys, you know. They often look like Tino de Angelis, warm, charming, hardworking men who show up at your office offering you exactly what you want to buy. They speak our language, they understand our secret desires, and they weaponize our own greed to bypass our security. They don't break our systems from the outside, they use our own compliance to hollow them out from within. And that is why the memory of this swindle remains so deeply unsettling decades after the final trial concluded. It serves as a permanent monument to the emptiness that can hide right behind the appearance of absolute success. It forces us to look at the massive structures we rely on every single day and realize that they are only as strong as the personal integrity of the human beings who are running them. And that integrity is a delicate thing. When you walk out of your house tomorrow and look at the businesses in your town, the banks on the corner, and the organizations that run your life, try to remember the lesson of the Bayonne tank farm. Don't let yourself be blinded by a shiny surface or a clever story designed to keep you comfortable. Take a steady breath, trust your instincts, and always find the courage to look beneath the oil because your own security depends entirely on your willingness to see the truth. The timing of this swindle in late 1963 adds another layer of historical weight to the entire tragedy, you know. This was a period when America was transitioning into a fast-paced, highly corporate era of global consumerism. People were completely enamored with new financial products, credit systems, and the promise of endless post-war prosperity. It was a time of absolute optimism, and that collective optimism created the perfect breeding ground for a predator like Tino to exploit the public trust. Now, when you think about the specific role that American Express played in this case, it reveals how a trusted brand name can be used as a shield to hide an absolute vacuum of substance. People looked at the American Express logo and assumed that their investments were as safe as gold inside a vault. They didn't realize that the company was just a collection of human beings who were capable of making catastrophic mistakes, or that a famous name can never replace real hands-on verification. This systemic failure is kind of a preview of the modern financial crises we see in our world today, you know. It shows that the human heart doesn't really change over time, and the same basic flaws that allowed Tino to succeed in 1963 are still active inside our corporate boardrooms right now. The technology might become more complex, and the numbers might grow larger, but the fundamental vulnerability remains exactly the same: our willingness to believe a profitable lie. But there is also a deeply humane lesson hidden inside the aftermath of this deception, a message about resilience and recovery. When the bubble burst and the true scale of the fraud was revealed, the community didn't just give up and let the system collapse entirely. So the honest workers, the legal teams, and the regulators had to roll up their sleeves and do the hard, tedious work of cleaning up the mess, rebuilding the rules of trade from scratch to protect the public. It shows that while a single dishonest person can cause an immense amount of destruction, the strength of a society ultimately comes from our collective willingness to face the truth and take responsibility for fixing what is broken. We can never completely eliminate the con men from our history, but we can build a culture that values transparency, accountability, and the courage to look past the surface layer of golden oil to see what is real. And that is the final takeaway message that should stay with you long after the story ends, you know. The safe fear we look for in these true crime narratives isn't just a form of cheap entertainment to pass the night. It is a vital exercise in moral vigilance, a way to test our own ethical boundaries from the comfort of our homes, so we can be ready when the real choices show up at our door. We look into the dark side of everyday life not to become cynical or distant, but to remind ourselves of the heavy value of truth, integrity, and personal responsibility. We have to take charge of what we choose to believe, because the moment we trade our critical thinking for an easy fantasy, we open the door for the monsters to step inside and take control of our lives. And that is a lesson we must carry with us through every single day. So, as you turn off your lights tonight and listen to the quiet sounds of your own home, take comfort in the fact that your reality is solid and your loved ones are safe. But let the memory of the great salad oil swindle remain as a small, quiet warning in the back of your mind. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and never forget that true substance is the only thing that can keep us anchored when the storms of deception blow through our world. When we evaluate the long-term impact of Tino's actions, we must also consider the psychological weight it placed on the entire banking community, you know. For generations, financial deals were sealed with a simple handshake, and a promise between gentlemen, and that trust was considered the ultimate asset of the industry. But after 1963, that gentlemanly trust was completely obliterated, replaced by a cold, clinical system of constant audits, legal fine print, and mutual suspicion. This shift away from personal trust towards systemic regulation has kind of altered the texture of our daily lives in ways we don't always notice, so to speak. We have traded our baseline faith in human honesty for a complex machinery of constant verification, surveillance, and legal protection. It is a necessary defense, of course, given what Tino proved about human vulnerability. But it is also a quiet tragedy, because it means we have lost a piece of our communal innocence along the way. The story reminds us that every single system we build to make our lives easier is ultimately vulnerable to the people who operate it, and no amount of regulation can ever completely replace the absolute necessity of individual conscience. When a society stops valuing individual integrity and starts focusing purely on external compliance, it creates a massive blind spot where a clever manipulator can easily find a way to redirect the rules for his own benefit. Tino was a master at navigating the bureaucratic rules of his time, using the very letters of the law to shield his massive fraud from view, you know. He knew exactly what the inspectors were required to check, and he designed his illusion to satisfy those specific requirements perfectly, proving that a compliance checklist can be a dangerous trap if it isn't backed up by real curiosity and a willingness to think outside the box. And that is why we must always maintain our internal compass, relying on our own moral judgment, rather than the declarations of an institution or a corporate title. We have to be willing to look at the world around us with clear, unblinking eyes, recognizing that the most dangerous illusions are often the ones that promise us exactly what we want to receive, and that vigilance is a continuous, non-stop responsibility. So as the final notes of this reflection fade away into the quiet darkness of your room, let your mind rest on the deeper value of what you have listened to tonight. Remember that the ultimate defense against the darkness of the world isn't a stronger lock or a more complex law, but your own willingness to stand firm in the truth, to keep asking questions, and to always look past the surface layer. Verify what is real,